Comics. Comics.
Welcome to this episode of ORP, the flagship show of the Open Comics Podcast Network. For today, we'll be getting into the second part of our discussion on Moon Knight, the Fist of Khonshu. If you're not familiar with the comics, Mike and I do a deep dive into many of the most important runs in part one of this series, so I'd suggest going back and watching that first. For now, though, we're turning our attention to Moon Knight on screen, and especially the recent Disney Plus series. Mike, do you have any opening thoughts before we dive into this series?
I sure do, Steve. I liked the Moon Knight series a lot when I first watched it, as I mentioned in the last episode, but I absolutely adore it now. I am not a Marvel expert, but from what I can tell, Moon Knight is probably one of the more accurately portrayed shows or movies from the MCU. I mean, obviously, there are some differences. That is really kind of guaranteed in any film adaptation. But nothing from what I can tell deviates so far away from the source material that the spirit of the character and his life is lost. I will also add that Moon Knight is definitely a show that is intended to be watched more than once. There are things that at least I didn't catch the first time through that really add layers to the show. But we will get into all of that in this episode. But how about you, Steve? What do you want to say before we really dive into this?
Now, I tend to have some mixed feelings on this show, though I like much more than I dislike. We'll get into some of the reasons for that as we discuss the episodes. But I will say that Moon Knight himself was perfectly cast, and Oscar Isaac's performance in the show raised my opinion of his acting. As for the adaptation itself, there are some things that the show adapts very well, and other things that left me scratching my head a bit. To be fair, though, it gets many of the core elements right, such as the basic origin, Mark's mental problems, and the range of genres that Moon Knight occupies. Moon Knight is definitely one of the standouts of Phase 4, and I wish that was more of a compliment than that sounds like. But I think there was something else you wanted to bring up before we move on, Mike.
There is, Steve. Before we dive into the episodes, I wanted to talk about some trivia about the series that I found particularly interesting. One of the things that was changed from the comic was that Marvel Studios decided to set Moon Knight in London to differentiate from the many other shows set in New York City. Because of that, Oscar Isaac decided to give Stephen Grant the high-pitched British accent, even though that wasn't indicated in the script. Isaac's accent for Stephen Grant was actually criticized by some who did not understand Isaac's intention with the accent. Isaac explained that the London English accent was intentionally bizarre and unconvincing. He did not elaborate on that, but my guess is that Mark's mind gave Stephen its interpretation of a London British accent. It was not spot on because it was not a genuine one. The actor himself was inspired by the accents of the Jewish community living in Enfield, London, as well as English comedians such as Carl Pickington and Peter Sellers.
You know, I always thought it was weird that they decided to have the Stephen Grant identity be British. I figured it was just because the writers thought it made sense to have him work at the British Museum, which does famously have a large share of Egyptian artifacts in its collection. But yes, I think you're right that Grant's accent was noticeably fake on purpose, and that absolutely does make sense given the reveals later in the series. But I think you had more to say about how Oscar Isaac was influenced to play Mark.
Why, yes, I do. To help him understand his character's dissociative identity disorder, Oscar Isaac read A Fractured Mind, the 2005 memoir by China's scholar Robert B. Oxnam, who learned through therapy in his 40s that the blackouts, depression, and alcoholism that had plagued him were actually the result of 11 distinct personalities. But there's a bit more to the three identities that struggle for the control of the character. Each of the three identities, Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and Jake Lockley, draw parallels with Freud's psychoanalytic proposals of the ego, superego, and the id, respectively. Mark is the ego, and so he is logical and analytical. Steven is a super ego, and so he is driven by morality. And Jake is the most primitive and instinctive side of the personalities, and so he is the id. In fact, you'll notice in the end credits that Oscar Isaac's title card appears with his face split into three. A big hint that in the mid credits reveal that his psyche contains a third person. In fact, there are a couple of times in the series where paying attention to the end credits reveals things about the show, but I will get more into that later.
The end credits do hint at things very noticeably, and I'll also add that I love the show's musical score as well. But to get back to your main points, that psychological take seems very likely, and it's not the first time we've seen this with Marvel heroes. For instance, the Hulk's main personas also draw from the id ego superego conflict. The Green Savage Hulk is the id, Bruce Banner is the superego, and Joe Fixit, the Gray Hulk, is the ego. But it's a very workable approach, and it's a valid approach to take with a character like Moon Knight as well. So I have no problem whatsoever with the way that they set up Mark's persona in the show in principle. But they did change a few things, didn't they, Mike?
They certainly do, Steve. There are just a couple more things that I want to bring up that deviate a little from the 616 universe, where the main comics continuity for Marvel Comics takes place. The Moon Knight suit is one of them. Mark Spector's Moon Knight suit has mummy wrappings on it, and while it is from the comics, it is based on the Earth X or Earth 9997 rather than the 616 universe. This was recommended by producer Kevin Feige as a means to distinguish the suit as ancient and mystic and therefore different from the other MCU armors. But there are two hieroglyphic markings on the MCU suit that I don't think are in any version of Mark's Moon Knight suit. The first hieroglyphic is on his trousers, and it reads, "Rise and live again as my fist of vengeance, my Moon Knight," which are Khonshu's exact words in the MCU. The second one is the crescent moon insignia on Mark Spector's Moon Knight suit. It has the hieroglyphics of Khonshu's name.
Huh. Now, this is where I start getting a little bit torn about the MCU's approach to the show because I actually don't have a problem with drawing on Egyptian imagery where it comes to Mark's costume, at least in theory. But at the same time, I miss the simplicity of the Moon Knight suit in the comics, which is just not magical in any way. At least if you leave out things like the mummy wrappings that Mark uses to fight ghosts during the War in Hellas run, which is awesome. I love the white shroud and hood against the jet black and of the rest of the costume. I also tend to prefer Mark without powers aside from whatever low-level strength he sometimes gets from the phases of the moon. But I also can't deny that you get some really cool stuff from the way the MCU does it, like having the crescent darts be the moon symbol that he wears on his chest. As for the Earth X influence, I'm a huge fan of Alex Ross in general, but he got really experimental on that series, and I didn't love a lot of the interpretations of the characters in Earth X. Still, I don't think any of these are necessarily bad influences that the show uses per se. Just probably not what I personally would have done, and that's fine. But moving away from the comics influences, I think you wanted to get into the Egyptian influences on the show, Mike?
Yeah, I got to talk about the myths as they come up, and that definitely has an influence here. So I want to give our listeners a basis to work from. But I have to start this out with a caveat. You see, if you go to 10 different regions in ancient Egypt, you're going to get 10 different versions of these myths. They varied heavily from region to region, so there is no way to nail down any particular version as the right one. In fact, according to the ancient Egyptians, all of the contradicting stories somehow are simultaneously true. I can't even wrap my head around that, but it's one of the reasons it was so difficult to study. But I am going to give you the blended version that I have adopted. In episode 1, they make what would seem like an offhanded reference to the Egyptian afterlife beliefs. But it is not offhanded and is in fact central to the story, I think, because this event connects Amit or Amut in the mythology to the story about Mark Spector in mythology. Things change from the myth in the MCU, but the show is clearly pointing at the myth with its references. I won't go into all the details here, and believe me, there are many, because it would go off my point. But suffice it to say that the Egyptians used magic in the form of written language from the Book of the Dead to get them through the underworld and the final judgment. The Anubis would greet the newly departed soul in the tomb and usher it to the Hall of Truth, where it would be judged by Osiris and the 42 judges, which include the Ennead or the Nine, which is why Arthur Harrow calls them judges. But Anubis is in an Ushabti in this series, and I will get into that in a bit. But it should be noted that at least in the Book of the Dead in the MCU, Taweret guides the soul to the hall of truth. And I think that Anubis being imprisoned and stoned is why. But the more common myth is that Anubis does this as one of the funerary gods. But back to the final judgment. Although Osiris was the principal judge of the dead, the 42 judges sat in council with him to determine the worthiness of a soul to enjoy continued existence. There in the hall of truth, the dead stand and plead their cases for innocence. The Book of the Dead provides the right words to say to each of the 42 divine judges and puts the soul into a position to be worthy of consideration, even if the person was not so innocent. But if you had the right words to say, you were found worthy of the second part of this final judgment. That part involves the weighing of the heart against the weight of the feather of truth, or the ma'at, and the symbol of virtuousness and justice by Anubis. You'll note that in the MCU, the scale that Taweret uses has Anubis holding the balance. If the heart was found to be heavier than the feather and therefore not virtuous, it was fed to Ammit, the devourer, or Ammit in the MCU, and the person's soul would cease to exist. Actually, that was one of the greatest fears of ancient Egyptians. There was a spell to get out of this one too, but the spell, while taken from the Book of the Dead, must be recited from an inscription on their heart scarab amulet. This spell would stop one's own heart from betraying them in the balance. I don't think that it is a coincidence that the servants of Ammit in the series would be after a golden scarab. I think that is a subtle callback to the heart scarab amulet that could save someone from being devoured by Ammit. Coincidentally, this amulet was an amulet of Khepri, the god of rebirth. But I will get into that more later. However, only in the MCU can Ammit see the past, present, and the future of a person. But if the scales were balanced, the deceased had passed the test, and Osiris, the chief god of the underworld, would welcome them into the field of reeds, or Aru in Egyptian. And in the MCU, it is beyond the Duat and the gates of Osiris. The Egyptian afterlife was actually a mirror image of the cultivated area of Egypt along the Nile, where rich and poor alike were provided with plots of land on which they were expected to grow crops. It was believed to be a place of lush vegetation with eternal springtime, unfailing harvests, and no pain or suffering. It looked like Mark Spector was in the midst of a crop in Aru, but the place was hardly a mirror of the fertile land of ancient Egypt along the Nile. But that is neither here nor there. But now is where we dive into some major changes. For instance, in the MCU, Ammit, through Arthur Harrow, who apparently possesses the feather of truth and scale of justice in his tattoo or some facsimile of them, seems to be doing the weighing of the person's heart as well as Taweret, and in both cases, it's instead of Anubis. It's interesting that more than one person does that job in the MCU, but that is not the only job that is done by two. Ammit is the devourer of the unvirtuous person if the scales don't balance when Harrow and his disciples judge. For the souls on Taweret's barge in the Duat, those that don't pass the test of the Ma'at get thrown overboard, and rather than the soul ceasing to exist as if it becomes nothing, it turns into sand. But there is more to it than that. If the Duat claims a soul, they must spend eternity claiming the unbalanced souls from the barge of Taweret. What's weird about this is that ancient Egyptians would rather spend an eternity in torment than cease to exist at all, which is what happens when Ammit devours you. But what do you say we finally dive into the series, Steve?
Wow, that's a very thorough dive into Egyptian mythology, and I think it should set up some important points in understanding how that mythology works in the series. Much of the main conflict is centered around the death and the judgment of souls, something that was a huge part of Egyptian belief, as you pointed out. And we'll see these ideas come back again and again during the show. But before we get into that, let's dive into the first episode of Moon Knight. I'll say that the first scene is a really creepy way to establish our villain, Arthur Harrow. The guy starts his day by breaking glass into shards and then pouring the shards into his shoes. I mean, this guy's feet will be hurting for days. But once you know what Harrow is about, I mean, this moment is even creepier because a man who is so convinced of his own righteousness and religious zeal that he'll literally walk on glass all day is extremely dangerous. Mike, what did you make of this scene in our first glimpse of Harrow?
I think I think I saw it as a whole other thing, actually. There's a thing in several religions called self flagellation, including in Egyptian cults. Granted, 9 times out of 10, that refers to beating or whipping yourself with a stick or a whip called a discipline. The idea here is to mortify or deaden one's sinful nature, aka the flesh, and it is considered a spiritual discipline. It is often used as a form of penance and is intended to allow the flagellant to share in the sufferings of Jesus, bringing his or her focus to God. Another form of penance is good deeds, and I believe that Arthur Harrow thought that was what his cult was all about. But put self flagellation and penance in an Egyptian context, and I can see the particulars changing a bit, even to something like walking on broken glass. Arthur Harrow carried the sin of many murders and lots of violence as Khonshu's former avatar. But his greatest sin, in his own words, was that he enjoyed doing those things. When Amun appears to him in episode 6, she tells him that his scales do not balance. And his response was that he had hoped that his penance might have balanced his scales, but that he sees now that that is impossible. And you'll notice that Amit says that his scale is not balanced because of what lies ahead of him as her avatar and not what lies behind him. That seems to imply that his penance works. So all of that to say, I do not get a self-righteous thing from that, but more the desire to do better.
Maybe, but there is a blindness in Harrow in his determination to be better. He's willing to do these horrible things he knows that he'll do if it means serving Amit and in crafting his idea of paradise. So even knowing this, he's willing to sacrifice his own sense of balance for the greater good to overcome his sense of guilt. But let's move on. Now, you'll notice that in part one, we never discuss Harrow at all in our discussion of Moon Knight's major villains. That's because Harrow was largely an invention of the show aside from the name. Arthur Harrow, the main villain of the show, was a minor character who appeared in just one issue of the Moon Knight comics, the second issue of Volume 2, which was published in April of 1985. And he's honestly pretty forgettable there, if I'm honest. But let's get into the creation of the MCU version. The show's creator, Jeremy Slater, said during a Q&A in his Twitter account on March 29th of 2022 that Arthur Harrow was chosen as the main villain of the show because Moon Knight's only recognizable villain was Bushman, who to him just felt too close to Black Panther's Eric Killmonger. So they decided to create a new villain instead. Slater also said that Ethan Hawke in particular was instrumental in creating Harrow, which I believe. Now, I have to push back against Slater a bit on this one. I can understand not wanting to use Raoul Bushman, though personally I don't think he's that similar to Killmonger, whether we're talking the comics or the MCU versions. Still, that's a fair decision to make. But to say that Moon Knight has no other recognizable villains is simply inaccurate. Black Spectre could easily have been the villain of this series, and he'd have fit in quite well into the story that they told in season 1. He's definitely a big enough villain to pull that off, and he's a strong contender for Moon Knight's arch nemesis. As we talked about in part 1, Carson Knowles is the dark mirror of Moon Knight, and he's had connections with the god Seth in the past. They could have had Black Spectre act as the avatar of Seth, and you could have had a really good conflict there without changing too much of the story. I don't know if this is just poor research on Slater's part or a deliberate omission, but Black Spectre is a top-tier Moon Knight villain, and he was overlooked here. To be fair, I think they made the MCU version of Harrow into an intriguing villain. And I agree that Ethan Hawke really sells that character. I think it's a bit too soon to get into exactly what makes him so interesting yet, but he does work in these episodes. But we will talk about the development of his character soon enough. But did you have anything you wanted to add, Mike?
I can certainly agree that Jeremy Slater seems to have a narrow view of Moon Knight's rogue gallery. That is the equivalent of saying, because I can't use the Joker, well, I guess I'll have to use Kite Man. At least if they turn Kite Man into an awesome character. But Black Spectre in particular could have been an awesome villain. I mean, Black Spectre really took Mark to a dark place and hurt people that he really loved. That kind of villain is actually one of my favorite types. If it were me, I mean, I personally would have rather gone with Morpheus as the villain. If we're going for possibilities that Slater could have used, you made him sound pretty fucking awesome in part 1 last week. But the point you're making, and I agree with, is that Slater had more options than just Raoul Bushman. But I believe you wanted to talk about Stephen Grant in this series, didn't you?
I do indeed, and I agree that Morpheus would have been another great pick, by the way. Now, from here, we get a glimpse into the life of Stephen Grant, who in this version is a museum gift shop vendor. He's a very mild-mannered British guy going about a normal 9-to-5 job. Now, if you listen to our discussion of part 1, where we talked about who Stephen Grant is in the comics, you may be wondering, what is this? And Believe me, that was my reaction watching it. Because in the comics, Stephen Grant is a billionaire financier and essentially the Bruce Wayne persona that Mark Spector puts on. But because Disney doesn't know how to leave well enough alone and just adapt the comics faithfully, I mean, this version of Stephen Grant is a completely new character invented for the show. And to be fair, Oscar Isaac plays him really well. But while he's meant to be the viewpoint character, he also does a lot of the Disney brand comic relief, and he can also get annoying at times. Mike, am I alone in thinking that way, or did you have any other thoughts on him?
I I think that it was worse for you than it was for me. In all the comics I have read, I don't remember ever seeing Stephen Grant as a Bruce Wayne kind of figure. In fact, Stephen Grant is not an identity I am all that familiar with, save but for a few brief things. My guess is that I have not read a lot of the early runs in the comic, and I think maybe that's where Grant played a bigger role. Perhaps if I was more familiar with the character, that's as familiar with the character as you are, I might have felt differently. But I was actually annoyed with Steven all of once, and I'll get to that later. But I liked the contrasting character and how the Stephen Grant character developed through the series. This I think this might be something I will take issue with later after I've read more of the comics. But I was cool with it. I think you had some more stuff you wanted to talk about in regards to Grant, though, wasn't there?
That's fair. I think I'm just bothered by characters like that in general, so that could have rubbed off a bit. As for the Bruce Wayne comparison, I was thinking more in the sense of the story role that Grant tends to play in the comics, where he hosts fancy parties to get information from high society people and things like that. But let's get back to who Grant is in the MCU. Where I think the episode starts getting good is where Grant starts having weird episodes. So he'll drift off and then he'll end up running away from Harrow's men with a scarab in his pocket. Then he'll go back to his normal life in London and things will be different. People will react to him strangely and he'll lose any sense of time because Mark was in control for days. I think they did a good job of building the horror and the sense of disorientation of losing control of your own self. But since you're the horror expert, Mike, how did those scenes come off to you?
I loved how they did the transitions, especially. I noticed that it becomes less violent as the series goes on and Mark and Steven get closer. You notice that when Mark took over in the Tomb episode, there was no accompanying distortion or break. He just switched over. As far as the horror goes, I'd say that this was definitely a horror kind of a moment, especially in the Stephen Grant perspective. But I'd say that this was a setup for the bigger horror moment later. That scene really made the scene where Stephen woke up on the bus and suddenly realized, as he saw people from what he thought were his dreams turn out to be his time switching back and forth between himself and Mark. Those people were obviously Harrow, who already scared Stephen to death, and Conchu. There is no way at that point to continue with the delusion that he has just a sleeping disorder. The sanctity and safety of his own mind at that point are gone. You'll notice that he was on the verge of a panic attack at that point.
There's definitely a sense of denial that is being ripped away at that point. I'm guessing that the transitions are more violent the more antagonistic Mark and Steven are towards each other, with the switch being more casual as they find a way to accept each other over time. But I think you had more to say about the transitions.
I will say this about the scene where they do keep switching back and forth, though. Uh, this "Wake Me Up Before You Go" playing while Steven keeps changing back and forth between himself and Mark is actually very apropos and even extremely funny, if you ask me. Check out these lyrics. "Wake me up before you go. Don't leave me hanging on like a yo-yo," like how Mark and Steven keep bouncing back and forth from each other. "Wake me up before you go, because I'm not planning on going solo." And he is not. There are four personalities in there. I think that is why his heart could not be read as good or bad, because they were both in him, or chaos, as Arthur Harrow put it. But I believe you had a bit more to add about the horror elements of the series, didn't you, Steve?
I do, but this is again where the musical choices get interesting. You can't go wrong with Wham. But I think you're right that the songs were chosen for narrative reasons that reflect Mark's inner struggle. I'd say that for Man Without Love by Engelbert Humperdinck as well, which comes up twice to bookend the series. Now, speaking of the horror scenes, there is one moment that seemed weird to me on rewatching it. Grant starts finding Mark's things, and then Mark's voice tries to warn him off. But then you get this weird nightmarish sequence where the building starts shaking, and then Grant starts getting these creepy visions of in the hallway while he's in the elevator. And to be fair, the moment itself is effective, and I was really into it. But I'm not sure exactly how that happened, as that's not something that Mark can do. The best I can think of is that Khonshu is messing with him somehow for some reason. Did you have any other ideas or anything that might make more sense of this scene?
Um, I do actually, but I'll be honest with you and tell you it is a little bit of a walk to get there. So kind of buckle in, I guess. But let
Okay.
me entice you with this. The name of the episode is The Goldfish Problem. Keep that in mind. So we know from episode 6 that the significance of the fish in Steven's tank having one fin is a link to Randall Spector having drawn a fish with only one fin. Keep in mind that when we find this out about Mark Spector's past, he and Steven are in the asylum going into the different rooms of Mark's mind. But back to that memory that corresponds to the goldfish. Wendy Spector, Mark's mom, clearly shows that Randall is the one she cares about. At least that was the message I got watching the scene. She did not say, "Be careful, boys," when they were going off to explore. It was, "Mark, watch your brother." So the goldfish is tied to feeling rejected, or at least looked at as less than his mother as well, especially considering how she treated him after that day. That same memory is when Randall dies in the cave, and the hatred and abuse of his mother starts culminating into the creation of Stephen Grant. I think that Mark was able to take the body when the logs started coming down, and Mark made it back to Steven's house. And when he did, he saw the fish with one fin. My guess is that he hated the memory as it reminded him of his brother's death and his mother's hatred and abuse. And so he went out and got a goldfish that had two fins. He also could have done it to help keep a gap between Stephen and the reality that he was made up by Mark as a defense mechanism. And that gap seems to have been getting smaller. I can't help but notice that Stephen is saying "laters, Gators" in the beginning of the series, something Mark said to his mom in that memory. Let's not forget the date with the woman from the work. The date could have been made by Jake Lockley, but it was most likely made by Mark, going with the theme of the episode. And yet Stephen was the one going on that date. They are beginning to, in Mark's own words at the end of the series, bleed together. And you'll notice that this ties last episode back to the first episode in the loop. I think Mark and Steven bleeding together is why Steven ate the steak at the restaurant. Then later, when Steven first talks to Mark in the mirror, Mark tells him to stop looking. He's trying to keep the identities separated to protect Steven, who I believe is Mark's innocence, the child in him before things got really bad. As far as the building shaking and the lights and stuff flying off the shelves, I think that some of that is Conchu. In particular, I'm thinking of the stuff flying off the shelves and the lights were Conchu. Harrow even tells Steven that the Conchu can do such things, but without an avatar, that is all he can do. But as far as the shaking goes, I have to tie it back to the goldfish problem. I can't help but notice that the ground shook in episode 5 Asylum when the truth about Mark and Steven's past was revealed and fundamentally changed the perspective of both Mark and Steven. There was definitely another fundamental truth being revealed in that scene you described as well. Steven was realizing Mark's presence. That lends credence to the idea that the event was in fact happening in Mark's mind, and that is where the asylum was. At least that's the only sense I can make of all that.
Wait a minute. When you tie the goldfish symbolism into the death of Randall, that gets really interesting. There's the trope of the replacement goldfish, the idea of someone trying to replace a loved one through another person. And I think that may have happened with Mark and his relationship with Stephen Grant. But I think it'll make more sense once we get to those later episodes. I suspect your theory will also click better with the complete picture in hand, though you do raise a good point there. So now I want to bring up a cool Easter egg that leads into a disappointment I had with the show. One of the numbers on Mark's call list includes the name Duchamp, a reference to his old friend Frenchie. Now, so Layla's on the list, and we see her later in the show, but not once do we ever see Frenchie in the entire first season. I hope that we see Frenchie if there's ever a season 2. It kind of sucks to tease such a major character like this and then just forget him completely. It's like having a Batman show without Alfred or a Daredevil show without Foggy Nelson. But what was your reaction, Mike?
My understanding is that Frenchie was hard to squeeze into the series and treat him with the respect that the character deserves. But if you ask me, why not just make more than 6 episodes? I mean, come on, man, 6 episodes? Anyway, I think Jeremy Slater might be able to explain it a little better. He said in an interview with Comic Book, there were times where we had versions of Frenchie in the show because you look at it, Frenchie does make sense for those first 2 episodes because they're all in London. They're all from Steven's perspective. Then we knew that once we were going to Egypt, we had to get them in the tomb pretty fast. And once wearing that final battle in the last two episodes, we're spending most of that in the Egyptian underworld. Jeremy Slater went on to say, so we knew episode 3 was really the only chance we had for a Frenchie cameo. And it kind of wound up of him just being a pilot, just flying them in. And it felt like a bad use of the character. Like it wasn't cool or memorable version of Frenchie. It was sort of like, oh yeah, he's the pilot in the background. So we made the decision of like, when we do Frenchie, let's do him right. Let's give him an actual role and an actual character and something to do with the storyline. So I think teasing his name on the phone was our way of letting Frenchie's fans know, like, yes, he does exist in this world. He definitely has some sort of business relationship or partnership with Mark. And hopefully that is something we get to explore in future episodes.
Well, that's an interesting answer. I'm not 100% convinced they couldn't have made it work better. I mean, they were able to get Layla in during episode 2, and there's no reason she couldn't have brought Frenchie with her. I just don't see why Layla and Frenchie wouldn't have been acquainted, especially since Frenchie would have been with Mark when Layla's father was killed. And I think they could have given him something to do if they'd planned it out right. But I guess it is what it is. If there is a season 2, though, hopefully he'll find his way in and they'll handle him properly. But I think you had an idea of something else that might be going on.
I do actually. Before we get into the ending, I'm going to propose a theory I have after watching the series a few times. I think Mark might be in a loop or at the very least reliving the last couple of months in his mind up until the point where he was shot and died. One of the first signs of this is when he is talking to the girl in the museum. You'll note that the little girl asks Mark if it sucked for him getting rejected from the field of reeds. And you'll notice that Stephen Grant was, in fact, pulled down to the sands of the Duat, and Mark Spector had to go back and get him. Plus, Stevens questions whether or not he is alive or not when the little girl said that, which screams about episode 5 and 6 dealing with the asylum in the underworld. But I believe you wanted to talk about the ending of the episode, right, Steve?
Yes, but before I do, you're certainly presented a theory that fits the facts that we have. The problem is that we're dealing with an unreliable narrator because Mark and his various other selves are clinically insane. It's possible that he could be imagining everything that happens to him. It's possible that he's dead and reliving his entire life before his eyes. It's possible that the girl that he met is foreshadowing something and she's somebody that the gods are possessing. There's just no way to know for sure. But I do like the idea that this is Stephen Grant reliving a set of fractured memories. So let's get into the ending. We have the confrontation with Harrow, who pretty much is in control of everything. It's a bit weird how much influence the cult of Ammit has here, but I can let that go. But we get a sense of what Harrow is trying to do, though I want to discuss his ideology more when we get to the next couple of episodes. But I have to say that Ethan Hawke really makes Harrow look threatening while also acting like he's a true believer in his own hype.
We will get into that more in a bit, but I can say that Harrow does what was first stated by President Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy: speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. Harrow only raises his voice a couple of times, and it's because everyone needs to hear him, not because he's trying to be threatening or anything. When you have power and people know it, you don't have to show it. And in fact, doing so when not absolutely necessary reveals your hand. But if you hold back, people are left to wonder about your wrath. But we have to talk about Moon Knight's first appearance in the series. So why don't you take it from here, Steve?
Anyone who has to say that he's the king is no true king. That's a good point. But yes, I can do that. Finally, let's get into the first real appearance of Moon Knight. I like that when we finally see him in that short glimpse, he is brutal and effective. Even though it's a Disney show, they do get a bit darker and grittier in terms of the action and the blood, even if there's not that much in this scene. And honestly, I kind of appreciate that they take that approach here. Now, I know that Mike loves himself some blood and gore, so I'm curious about your take on this. Did you feel the same way, or would you rather they have gone farther with it?
The blood and violence was definitely turned up for this series, as well as the darkness they are willing to dive into. For instance, the part where Mark goes away and Steven comes back and he's holding the scarab in his hand, it's all extremely bloody there. Then later, when Mark takes over in the truck, you see that he has blood running down from his knuckles, which implies a pretty severe beating. And even the corpse that was in the back of the van had more blood and looked way more dead than Disney usually shows. I mean, he looked like he had lost lots of blood. And usually Disney does not delve into stuff like that, even for implied violence. Well, I personally would have liked to see a bit more. I am impressed with how far the family-friendly Disney went with it. They get an A for effort there. But how about we dive into episode 2?
Awesome. So let's do that. It's really interesting how Grant wakes up the next day and Harrow has completely covered his tracks. It seems like they erase all trace of Moon Knight too. They never really explain how Harrow does this at any point. I'm sure some of it must have been magical, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Harrow used the cultists inside the museum to doctor the security footage to make Grant look bad. In any case, it leads to Grant being fired from his job and contributing to his general confusion because he's mentally unbalanced anyway. Does that seem plausible to you, Mike, or do you have another theory?
Actually, I think that you are both right and wrong there. I think that Harrow and his men had something to do with how that looked the next day, but not quite how you think. In my opinion, they seem to be leaning heavily into the fact that Mark Spector is insane by saying that there were no jackals chasing Stephen. What's more is that there appears to be no Arthur Harrow on the camera either. This is particularly true about the Death Dogs. Nothing that they touch is moving like it did when we saw it before, which is weird because a death dog is definitely a physical being later on in episode 2. At first, I assumed that this was some ability of Arthur Harrow to make Steven see things that were not there. But I mean, I did a lot of research and I can't find a single thing that says that Harrow has this ability. In fact, all that I can find in relation to this is that he has the ability to summon jackals from the underworld. So it has to be an insanity issue mixed with Harrow and his disciples perhaps knowing where the cameras would be. There's also the possibility that it turned out this way because it was happening in Mark's mind. But as far as the employees being involved, I have to say that if you're going to find a bunch of Egyptian history and mythology buffs, you have a good shot at finding them in a museum. Does that make any more sense to you, Steve?
It helps somewhat, at least. Now we do know that these death dogs can turn invisible, so that's part of it too. But it could be that because he's an avatar, that Mark's the only one that could see the death dogs if Harrow didn't want anyone to see them. I do think it's probable that the footage was doctored by the security people in Harrow's corner, though. It would at least explain why Harrow wasn't anywhere in the footage. I don't think it's likely that Mark or Steven imagined any of what they were fighting, at least. But I think we have a better idea of what's going on now. So let's move on. Where things start to get really interesting is the scene where Grant stumbles on Mark's safe house and starts rummaging through everything. You really see the disconnect between Mark and Grant and how deep the mental break is. Stephen doesn't trust Mark at all, and he's getting weirded out. Mark is getting annoyed with Stephen's refusal to get with the program, and Khonshu is getting fed up with the whole thing. It's a really great scene, and I have to say that I started really being impressed with Oscar Isaac's performance in both roles. But I guess I should ask whether Grant is right to distrust Mark at this point, or if it would have made more sense to play along.
First of all, anytime Khonshu gets upset is a good thing in my book. Bugging him is awesome in my opinion, but Stephen is still under the impression that his experiences are a sleep disorder. He has no idea what is happening, and since what is happening is against who he is or thinks he has no reason to do it. You remember when the two cultists came to the flat under the guise of police officers? Well, Mark flat out tells the officer that the rope is because of a sleeping disorder. Like Steven described to that street performer, his body just wants to get up and move around. I don't think it would be rational to assume that he should be leaning into what he thinks is sleepwalking. But that's just my 2 cents. So what do you think about that?
He's probably completely disoriented and scared out of his mind and not acting rationally. So I think there's that angle to it. He probably doesn't even know what he should believe at this point, which is entirely understandable. Anyway, later in this episode, we get our first glimpse of Layla, who is revealed to be Mark's estranged wife. So let's get this out of the way first. Layla is clearly an analog of Marlene Allrod. She plays very much the same role as Mark's love interest and partner, and their backstories are similar as well. There are differences, though. Layla is an archaeologist herself, which Marlene never was in the comics. And Layla doesn't play the balancing influence on Mark to the extent that Marlene did in the comics. Layla is also Egyptian, which I think is a large part of the reason why Disney went with this character as opposed to just using Marlene. But what did you make of this decision, Mike? What are your thoughts on the Layla character and using her in place of Marlene?
I will talk a bit more about this in a minute, but I think that the differences are because she is based on two characters and not just one, and that the MCU made her and her family Egyptian. As far as Layla being a balancing influence on Mark, the series seems to have that at least a little bit in there, especially with their talk on the boat on their way to Anton Margot's house, and how she gets the two halves, or rather thirds, of Mark to work together, explaining that Steven needs Mark and Mark needs Steven. But also, the series seems to lean into being about Mark finding balance within himself.
There is that true. I will admit to being a bit surprised that she had another character mixed in at first. I just figured they just basically used Marlene's character and slapped on another name or something like that. But I'm sure we'll get into that in more depth in a moment. It's pretty clear that Mark had been playing games with even with Layla, and it's understandable why she had gotten tired of them. He's been keeping some pretty big secrets, even from his own alters. At the same time, we see that Layla still cares about Mark enough to go around the world to London to bail him out of his latest mess. I don't think Grant quickly realizes that Mark is a twat to leave somebody like her behind, let alone try to divorce her. But at the same time, we see that Mark has had some pretty solid reasons for doing so. He's afraid that the Harrow situation is too big for her, and he's concerned that she'll end up killed. But still, Layla's a really likable character from the moment that she first appears, and enough to make it okay that she isn't Marlene. Layla and Mark had this complicated relationship, which is made even more complicated by the presence of Stephen Grant. So I guess the big question is, was Mark right to try to leave her behind, or would he have been better off keeping her in the loop?
Um, in my opinion, Mark absolutely needed to leave her behind because he knew from Khonshu's own mouth that if he was not Moon Knight, then Khonshu would approach Layla about being his avatar instead. Plus, Mark probably believed that he was on a one final mission, and that is why he promised he would leave when he was done. But as Arthur Harrow pointed out, there was always going to be one more mission for Mark. Khonshu would never let him go. Also, as a side note, you'll note that Mark later amended his deal with Steven to include another mission, just like Khonshu did to him and did to Harrow. Plus, of the two identities we see, at least until the mid credits scene of episode 6, Mark is the only one who has always been aware of Steven. He knew how broken he was. Maybe, as Harrow said, Mark really did feel that he did not deserve love. As far as Steven saying that he would never divorce Layla, that was the one moment I referenced earlier when I got annoyed with Steven. He doesn't even know her. Maybe it's because I'm asexual and have zero intentions of getting into a relationship, but I loathe it when men are just blindly infatuated with women. Steven acts like he's already in love with her, and I suppose that maybe Mark's feelings for Layla were bleeding over there, and that is what Steven was responding to. But my response when he said that was that it was pathetic. Talking to nobody but my cat, it bothered me so much I said that out loud.
Yeah, it is way too early for Steven to have any attachment to Layla at all at this point. They do force the love triangle a little bit between the different personalities, and there are moments it just doesn't work like it does here. I think the most likely explanation is, as you said, that Mark's feelings are bleeding in subconsciously into the Stephen Grant persona. So let's get into the next scene. Now, I admit that I don't have a deep knowledge of what police procedure is like in London. Still, I had a hard time believing that London cops can just push their way into someone's home without something like probable cause, the express permission of the resident, or a legal search warrant. So already these cops look pretty suspicious. Now, maybe listeners in the UK can clarify this point, but according to what I've read on the subject, they would have needed a warrant, which they did not show, or the permission of the occupant, which Grant did not give. He just opened the door and they pushed their way inside. The police also would have had to expressly state the reason for their entry and any legal powers they would have to justify the entry, which these cops also did not do. So pretty much the entire search of Stephen Grant's apartment is probably illegal, and I'd give good odds of a fair judge tossing the whole case, assuming that he wasn't in cahoots with Harrow. But again, I'm not an expert on the subject of UK law, and I could well be wrong about this. So after all this, it's pretty obvious that these detectives are cultists working for Arthur Harrow. It's no surprise that they take Grant straight to him, given how suspicious that these cops have been acting. But before we dive more deeply into Harrow and his character, I should ask, did you have any other thoughts on this scene?
Well, you covered it pretty well, but something jumped out at me that did not for you, or at least you didn't mention it. Do you remember when the male cultist brought that pyramid to Stephen and asked him what it was? Consider that time on screen is at a premium and realize that there had to be more than that scene than just talking about a paperweight. Remember that when Mark was in the asylum in the comics written by Lemire, Khonshu told him that he was in reality on a spaceship, and that spaceship in the comics was a pyramid. I do not think that it is coincidental, especially with how hard they're leaning into Lemire's run in the comics. In short, it is possible that all of this was just happening in Mark Spector's mind. But again, this is but one of many clues which speaks to that, in my opinion. But what do you think about that, Steve? Am I way off here?
No, it's a plausible theory. I don't think there's enough to say with certainty that that's what's going on, but it's a good alternate take on the situation that's consistent with the comics they're leaning into for sure. But speaking of the comics, Mike, there's another comics character who is involved with Layla's backstory, and that's the Scarlet Scarab. And we see some of that reference around this point in the episode. Now, while I was generally aware of the character, he was not someone who was ever really on my radar. Do you want to talk about the Scarlet Scarab and how that character fits into Layla's development and what goes on into Stephen Grant's apartment?
Sure, Steve. The character of Layla El Foley is based on Marlene Oran, as you pointed out, but also the Scarlet Scarab, specifically the second Scarlet Scarab, Mehmet Fol. Though the last name is changed to El Foley, probably because they were blending characters and they made Layla Egyptian. The last name not only bears a resemblance to the Scarlet Scarab's comic book name, the family name El Foley is borne by more people in Egypt than any other country or territory. The Scarlet Scarab connection with her goes back to her father, whose name was changed from Dr. Alran to Dr. Abdullah El Foley. But even Abdullah is different from Abdul, the name of the original Scarlet Scarab. And again, I think that is because the MCU made the family Egyptian. Don't forget that Layla's father called her Little Scarab and wore a fuchsia scarf that had scarabs on it. Now, Abdul in the comics lost the fist-sized red ruby that gave him his powers when the jewel had depleted its power and returned to where he found it. The jewel went through many hands after that, but Abdul spent the next 20 years looking for the ruby. In fact, it was Abdul's dying wish that his son Mehmet continue his father's search. Mehmet considered it his duty continuing his father's quest, searching for years as his father had. In the MCU, it would seem that Layla's father believed that the Egyptian gods were real and walked among us. He desperately searched for proof of that, and I believe that Layla took on that as well in his duty. Another thing that Layla character picked up from the Mehmet character was that one of Mehmet's goals was the protection of Egypt's priceless ancient artifacts, just like Layla and even Anton Margot, aka the Midnight Man. Now, in my opinion, I think that the MCU said the mystical ruby that empowered the first two Scarlet Scarabs was replaced with an actual scarab. And that when Layla, obviously taking Mehmet's role, found the scarab in the duffel bag, she thought that Mark had found the scarab that her and her father had been searching for. That's why she reacted the way she did. Granted, Layla ends up becoming the Scarlet Scarab by becoming Taweret's avatar, but and not by finding the scarab, but I think my point stands.
Two scarabs and a duffel bag. Anyway, they were leaning into the idea of the scarab by having Layla find it the way that she did. I agree. I didn't realize it on first viewing because I didn't think too much about the Scarlet Scarab connection. The Scarlet Scarab never really had any connection to Moon Knight or his mythos in the comics, and he was honestly a pretty obscure character. But it seems like the show decided to weave that in with the Layla character, as you pointed out. Now, from here, Harrow decides to have a chat with Stephen Grant, presumably to convert him to the glories of Ammit. What he decides to show Grant is a neighborhood of Ammit's faithful, which he presents as an ideal of Ammit's justice. We get to see both sides of the argument between Harrow and Khonshu, based on two very different ideas of justice. Khonshu believes in avenging injustice after it has been committed, while Harrow believes that suffering can be avoided by ending injustice before it can start. I don't know about you, but I get a very Minority Report vibe from Harrow's entire speech. It comes across as being very much a pre-crime thing, where people are punished simply for what they might do, not what they actually have done and are responsible for. They're given no chance to change their ways before they commit the crime. So technically, you're punishing innocent people by doing this. There is also no opportunity for redemption, for learning from one's sins or mistakes, because these people are destroyed before they ever have a chance to atone for anything. It's a summary judgment. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. All of which is today is I understand why Stephen Grant doesn't accept Harrow's offer, as I have serious problems with it myself. But I know you love philosophy and tough moral choices, Mike. So, what was your take on it? Is the paradise promised by Amit worth the cost it asks for?
Well, for I will get to that, but first I have to say the whole thing with Ahmed and Arthur Harrow has a very Minority Report vibe to it. We are of one mind in this one. Um, you consider this: you have a precog or Ahmed seeing people commit crimes before they do it, and then they are judged for the crime or sin by an agent or avatar in this case. But as to Ahmed's philosophy, no, I do not think it is a proper form of judgment. The same paradise could be achieved at a proper time after the real final judgment by Osiris and the 42 judges. I will get into that a bit more later, but both Ahmed and Harrow suffer from a lack of love and patience. That said, though, I think Stephen Grant and maybe even you might be seeing this incorrectly. Amit's judgment is based on knowing one's past, present, and future all at once. So they already know if the person will learn from their mistakes or change. It would be like the old discussion of whether or not you would go back in time and kill Hitler as a child and prevent all of the things that would happen as a result of him in the process. You already know what will happen if he lives. Looking at that dispassionately, there is some logic to the idea of pulling the weeds before they kill the roses, as Harrow put it. It is not acting in love. If that were the case, Harrow could simply explain the path that they were on and counsel them away from it. They seem to lack the embracer quality of Khonshu. And speaking of Khonshu, Amit's and Harrow's faith is completely against how ancient Egyptians looked at things. There is a reason souls were judged at the end of their lives. And I like that twist because it uses the myths in a clever way to pit the gods against Amit and Harrow against Moon Knight. I'm just speculating here, but it occurs to me that to be the fist of vengeance, the person being attacked by definition must have done something already. Otherwise, there is no vengeance. It's just an action. But as far as how the Egyptians viewed it, there is a righteous reason souls were judged at the end of their lives. And of the faiths that I have studied, if there is a judgment, it is after death. I infer from this commonality that it is a divine principle shared by many. So Amen and Harrow, in my opinion, are not just violating the fundamental principles of Egyptian deities and their functions, but something that would seem to be wrong across pantheons. But what do you say we get into where this new Arthur Harrow character comes from?
No, I think our difference on this issue probably comes from our different ideas on fate, to be honest. I get what you're saying, but Amit's view presupposes that our lives are predetermined to always happen a certain way. And I don't think the future is quite that ironclad. But that discussion takes us way off tangent, and we'll be here for hours. So I'm going to leave it for the audience to think about.
You know, I had not considered my perspective on fate coming into or affecting that. But I think you're right that it might just be the differences in our points of view. But as you say, let's move on.
Yeah, that sounds good. So now that we've talked about Harrow's ideology, I think this is a good time to get into where this version of Harrow came from. There's a strong fanatical element to Harrow, and that's not by accident. Ethan Hawke based his character of Arthur Harrow on religious leader David Koresh. Koresh was the leader of an offshoot of Christianity called the Branch Davidians, who had made a ranch in Mount Carmel Center near Waco, Texas, and their home was a place of worship that had been since 1935. Like Harrow, Koresh's faith and his devotion to his God was absolute. Well, at least until he died in a federal raid.
Yeah. I, I'm afraid I just don't agree with that assessment. Arthur Harrow seems to be a benevolent preacher, and his kindly demeanor and the reassuring, soothing tone of his voice have earned him the respect and devotion of his followers. I can respect a person whose belief and piety are like iron. Unwavering faith is an admirable quality, whether or not I agree with the person's faith. But Arthur Harrow, while he may appear to be such a person on the surface, still has not rid himself of the enjoyment of killing. By his own confession, his greatest sin was that he enjoyed dealing out death and pain on Khonshu's behalf. For instance, it is Arthur Harrow who drains the life out of a person after the scales are weighed, and the staff of Ammit reveals the person's sin. You'll notice that Harrow does not exclusively kill those who have been judged. Sometimes just being a homeless man and finding a scarab on the ground is a death-worthy trespass after offering them food and shelter. He also shoots and, for all intents and purposes, kills Mark Spector with a gun. If you ask me, a person whose beliefs in sin, right and wrong are absolute as Amit's judgments are absolute, then even if it was more difficult, Arthur Harrow would have found a way to get the Ashanti without murder, which is a sin. But morality was set aside for the sake of convenience. My point is that, in my opinion, I hate to disagree with you, but Arthur Harrow's piety is not absolute. I believe a part of him does want to change and do better, as most of us do. But if he was the kind of person he pretends to be, morality could never be cast aside, as that would mean judgment from Amit. But you'll notice Amit has zero issues with disproving something is off with her as well.
You know, that point reminds me of a line from Life of Pi where the older Pi Patel talks about the idea that faith is a living thing, but that doubt leaves it room to grow. So it may be something similar with Harrow, where he just has a tiny smidge of doubt, leading him to prove his faith even more in response. So let's get back to a more comics related tangent. So, after our discussion about Mr. Knight in part one, I know you love the comics version of Mr. Knight as much as I do. I was really looking forward to seeing him in the show, and they did admittedly get the costume down right, and I really appreciated that. But because Disney's going to Disney and they have to make needless changes from the source material, they make the decision of giving the Mr. Knight suit to Stephen Grant. In fact, we do not actually get the Mr. Knight comics persona anywhere in the entire first season. That was such a huge letdown to me. It doesn't help that the whole scene gets extremely goofy the entire time that Grant is in charge of Mark's body after that, with the silly "I am Steven with a V" song. As someone who's a Steven with a V, I just really hated that entire moment. It just comes across as goofy Disney comic relief. It just doesn't really help the show in any way. It is nice to see Stephen Grant have some abilities and that he's not totally useless in a fight, but this wasn't really the way to do it. In my view, am I alone in that, Mike, or did you find Grant as annoying in that sequence as I do?
I took that in an entirely different way. Neither the security guard or his boss had any respect for Steven at all. In fact, they could not really stand Steven. He annoyed the shit out of them, especially his boss. His boss called him Stevie, a very childish version of Steven, because she perceived him as less than an adult, and it was yet another way for her to demean him. Steven obviously, at least to me, picked up on that, so he was correcting her. He was not a child and therefore not Stevie. It certainly wasn't an attempt to flirt or play with him on her part, as sometimes happens. It was clearly meant to be derisive. With the security guard, he cared so little about Steven that he never even bothered to learn his name. And even when Steven constantly corrects him, he keeps calling him Scotty. And that seems to go beyond not giving a shit to deliberately fucking with him. As for Stephen Grant being Mr. Knight, I think we saw signs that there is a badass in there somewhere, and he certainly does come out by episode 6. Also, and this is just a theory, Stephen Grant was originally Mark's mask to the world, especially in terms of business. You'll notice that in episode 6, it is Stephen Grant that negotiates the deal with Khonshu. Plus, what if Steven will be portraying the consultant aspect of Mr. Knight in the MCU, or maybe even the High Priest of Khonshu aspect from the Midnight Mission? These are gentler aspects of Mr. Knight, and maybe that's what they were thinking?
Maybe, but I'm wondering if we might be misinterpreting each other a little, because I wasn't referring to Stephen correcting the various people who get his name wrong. That wasn't my problem. I totally get that. I was more bothered by the sing-song routine that Stephen goes into during the fight with the Death Dog. I just didn't find the line funny, and it just took me out of the scene. I mean, to address your other points, I mean, I can buy the idea of Stephen being a social mask for Mark when dealing with people. That's a workable idea. I grant that the people in his life don't take him seriously and they actively dismiss him at every turn. We do see that consistently. And to be fair, that probably isn't helping his self-esteem very much. And that may be why he acts out as he does in the fight.
Okay. That actually makes more sense. It does seem like we were not hearing each other as we intended. I can totally agree with what you said there.
All good. I probably should have been more clear about what I was responding to, though. I just feel like the scene undercut the coolness of Mr. Knight. I just miss the Mr. Knight who might have been more approachable, but was still a badass when he needed to be. I mean, Steven may get better at that later, but it's towards the end, and for that, I would rather wear his own costume. I just want the Mr. Knight who's willing to bash somebody's face in with a truncheon. But I am glad that at least they got the Mr. Knight suit down right. They did do that right. Fortunately, the last few minutes of the show makes up for everything involving Stephen Grant because Mark takes over again, and we actually get him to see him be awesome. I was especially happy to see Moon Knight do his rooftop jumping in that chase with a jackal. It felt like something you would see in the comics. This is the kind of thing I wanted to see from a Moon Knight show, and we did get a glimpse of that in this episode at least. So for me, this show is at its best when Mark is in control. But so I credit this episode for ending on a high and making me want to see more. Mike, did you have any final thoughts on episode 2 before we move on?
Well, yeah, I do actually. I find it interesting that the storage number Stephen went to was 43. In the 1992 comic Moon Knight number 43, Moon Knight teams up with Dane Whitman, aka the Black Knight, which is at least a hint that Moon Knight and Black Knight might be teaming up. Also, in Marvel's Eternals, we learn that Cersei's human boyfriend, Dane Whitman, is the Black Knight because of his name and because they reveal the Ebony Blade. They also reveal that it was, in fact, Blade who asked Dane if he was ready to take up the blade, which might actually hint at a Midnight Suns thing going on with Black Knight. Or maybe, Blade, being an expert swordsman, will teach Dane Whitman how to wield the Black Blade.
Well, I'm a love me some Midnight Suns. Eternals is a movie that I would just as soon forget existed. I mean, even other MCU films forget that it happened. I think it's unlikely that the number means anything, though, unfortunately, since that is a deeper comics reference than a lot of filmmakers are probably aware of. It is an interesting reference to be sure, but it's also a pretty obscure one.
That's totally fair. I just couldn't help but do like I do and try to find connections with everything. But my guess is that the future of Black Knight in the MCU will tell on that one. But let's dive into episode 3.
Sure thing. I love that we finally get an episode focused on Mark and Control because he's the most entertaining persona to watch for me. It also shows Mark in his element, doing Indiana Jones style fights in the streets of Cairo as he tries to locate Harrow. All the Mark scenes early on are fun to watch, and this is the kind of stuff I long wanted to see with Moon Knight, so I was digging it. But this leads into another complication that I wanted to bring up. This is a bit of a spoiler, and I don't want to dive it into too much until the end, but it's interesting in that in the middle of Mark's Egypt adventure, it's now Mark's turn to start blacking out, only to regain control somewhere else. They're clearly setting up a new alter who's even bloodier than Mark, and I'm stunned that this is even possible. I'm also, in retrospect, even starting to wonder if this third alter is the one that was in control during the first episode. Does that seem off base, or are you reading the situation differently at all?
I wondered a bit about that in the first episode as well, particularly when that guy took the scarab out of Steven's hand and he changed. While we did not see it just based on the blood and the bodies, I'm guessing that situation was pretty violent, perhaps more so than Mark would have done. So no, you're not the only person who was thinking that. I definitely was thinking that too.
Cool, so we're on the same page on that. Now, I want to get into something I glossed over in the second episode, and that's the decision to give Moon Knight magic armor. Khonshu openly states that this is healing armor, and the reason that Mark has survived things that would otherwise have killed him. I don't know about you, but it's a move that I'm still somewhat torn about. In the comics, Mark has sometimes gotten power-ups from Khonshu, usually nothing too noticeable. But here they're going with the idea that the costume itself is magical, and it can take the form that the wearer chooses. So this is how you get Mark as Moon Knight and Grant as Mr. Knight. I don't know, but part of me really prefers that Mark draws more on gadgets rather than magic armor and ancient relics. I feel like he's more of a badass when you see him beating enemies with his own strength and skill, rather than relying on Khonshu for all of his toys. At the same time, I do think they thought out a workable mythos that works for the show and the story they're telling. It's cool for what it is, but I prefer the book version a little bit more. Do you have a preference, Mike, or am I just being too much of a comics purist here?
I think that I do prefer the comics as well. But that said, I would like to point out that Mark definitely relies on magic when his first resorts fail. As you brought up earlier, we both loved where Moon Knight had to fight ghosts and had to rely on ancient magical Egyptian wrappings to defeat them. But while Mark is definitely a badass with weapons and gadgets, I didn't feel that it was too far off to have the magical armor. So in that respect, I think there might be a bit of a purist in there. But I feel like I should add that there seems to be a bit more magic being used, which is very apropos to ancient Egypt. If I could switch gears here just a bit though. So in the comics episode last week and earlier in this discussion, we talk about Moon Knight getting super strength and certain levels of resistance to damage based on what the phase of the moon is. Moon Knight clearly shows some levels of both super strength and invulnerability. The moon is shown in the closing credits in a different phase for each episode. Like pulling that bumper off the car as well and crushing in his hand when he grabbed it. I think that was certainly a sign of super strength. But I think that Moon reflects both Mark's status of being whole and balanced, as well as a guide to his power levels. Do you have any thoughts on that, Steve?
I get the sense they probably intended it on a metaphorical level, with Mark becoming gradually whole as he becomes more in tune with himself. The idea of his journey being about opening up and making his heart more full plays out in a number of different ways in the show. So he becomes stronger in a sense as he reaches the full moon, symbolizing the fullness within himself. So from here, Mark and Khonshu set up a meeting with the Ennead, the Council of the Gods of Heliopolis. I don't want to steal your thunder here in describing the scene, Mike. Knowing your love for all things mythic, I'm sure you probably have plenty of wisdom to impart about the Ennead and how there's been portrayed in this episode. So, as we get into the scene, why don't you give us a rundown on the Ennead and how they've been adapted here?
I'd be glad to, Steve. It should be noted that the Great Ennead, or the Nine, are part of a short lived abandonment of traditional polytheistic beliefs in Egyptian mythology. They are also part of the 42 divine judges in the Hall of Truth that aid Osiris in the final judgment. One pharaoh named Akhenaten restructured the gods into a kind of henotheistic religion of Aten, who literally was the sun, which is why he is later equated with Ra and later Horus. Henotheistic worship is when a supreme god is worshipped, in this case Aten, but does not deny the existence of other gods, and that's why I use the word restructured. According to Akhenaten, who founded the city Heliopolis, and yes, that is the city Marvel version was named after, in the beginning there was only the primordial waters known as Nun. Out of those waters rose a mound on what is called the first occasion. On top of that mound that rose up out of none was the self created god Aten, thus making him the supreme and prime deity. From him came Shu, the god of air, and his twin sister Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and rainfall. From Shu and Tefnut came Geb, the god of the earth, and his sister Nut, the goddess of the night sky. Geb and Nut were the parents of Osiris and Isis and of Set and Nephthys, who became respective couples in turn. Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, is included in the creation tradition, and well as being the final member of the Great Ennead, or the Nine. So just a quick sum up, the Great Ennead was comprised of Aten, Shu, Tefnut, Geb, Nut, Set, Nephthys, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. So that is the past. Let's get caught up with the present via Moon Knight. After each generation of Heliopolis gods retired from earthly rule, they traveled to the dimension of a celestial Heliopolis to live out eternity. Beginning with the rule of Thoth, however, all the gods moved to the overvoid dimension realm to traffic with the earth no more. And that is where we find said gods in Moon Knight. However, the five in attendance at the meeting of the gods in the Pyramid of Giza were Hathor, Horus, Isis, Tefnut, and Osiris, all of which, except for Hathor, were part of the Great Ennead that Stephen Grant refers to. But we know that others exist, like Bast, the panther god of the Wakandans, who we see guarding the tomb of Ammit. Another one that comes up later in the comics is Bes, the god of luck and probability. Plus, when the gods imprisoned Khonshu in the Ushabti in episode 4, Osiris placed him on a shelf of sorts with 9 other gods that had been imprisoned in an Ushabti. I don't know about you, but I was dying to know who those gods were in hopes that some gaps might be filled in. It is clear that the Ennead has been imprisoning gods in stone for quite some time by how many other Ushabtis are on the wall. And in Osiris's own words about Khonshu being imprisoned in stone, he said, like many before him. But the lighting makes it difficult to see them all. And luckily, we get shots of the Ushabtis during the end credits. Granted, you have to pause and make them out, but those shots really help fill in the blanks. The very first one I noticed was Anubis. Anubis statues in art always depict him as a jackal-headed god, and that Ushabti definitely looks like Anubis. As I have explained already, Anubis was the god that greeted the person's soul and led them to the Hall of Truth for their final judgment. What's more, it was Anubis who placed the feather of truth, or the Ma'at, on the scales of justice to balance the person's soul against it. The fact that he is imprisoned in stone explains why Ammit and Harrow have taken over judgment of humanity, and why Taweret is leading souls through the Duat, a place in the underworld where the sun god Ra goes into darkness. Ra was attacked nightly on his barge by the giant surface Apophis, or Apep, who tried to prevent the sun from rising and so destroy all of life on Earth. Ra was said to be reborn in the morning. The Duat has no place in the afterlife of the soul normally, at least according to what I have read. As I have said before, there are many versions to this story. There are 4 gods that specifically deal with childbirth from conception to the family they were born in that were imprisoned in stone, and I can't think of a single reason for any of them. Bes is fairly easy to recognize as he is one of the few gods who look essentially human. Bes, who is married to Taweret, is the protector of households, the god of luck and good fortune, and was even a symbol of all that was good. One thing that Bes has in common with his wife Taweret is that they are both protectors of mothers and children. I can't think of a reason why Bes would have been imprisoned in stone, nor can I think of a reason for Hecate to be an Ushabti. But I'm guessing it might be the same reason that Bes was, as Hecate is also involved with children. She's specifically a goddess of fertility, and she is known as the goddess of midwives. Hecate is closely tied to her husband, Kunum. Kunum's Ushabti was right next to Khonshu's on the wall. Kunum was the ram-headed god of the source of the Nile and all that it provided to the people in the land. Kunum is known for creating humanity's children out of clay from the Nile on his divine potter's wheel and then placing the children in their mother's wombs. He is referred to as the divine potter and later on is even said to have molded the other deities. I actually have a theory about this next god, and it is because of his connection to rebirth. Capri is that god, and he is the only scarab-headed deity that I know of. I mentioned earlier that the heart scarab amulet had the magic that allowed one's heart to not betray them on the scales of justice. Well, one of those same amulets was imbued with the power to guide someone to Amit's tomb like a compass, and I have to believe that is the reason we see Capri in the Ushabti. But he may have committed more than one crime. Capri was connected to the morning sun and by extension rebirth. Priests would often put scarab amulets alongside the deceased to aid in the process of rebirth. I can't help but notice that Heka priests in Amit's tomb were working on the process of rebirth and rejuvenation magic. Maybe Capri helped Amit and went down for it. The serpentine Gadget Wadjet, who is often depicted with the sun disk, can be seen on the wall to the right of Anubis. She was the protector of kings and women in childbirth. So perhaps she died along with the other 4 gods I mentioned that are connected to children or family in some way. However, Wadjet is very closely associated with Aten, the prime Egyptian deity that became the god Ra. She was considered a direct agent of Ra, hence the moniker Eye of Ra. In fact, the symbol of the Eye of Ra is called a Wadjet. So for the Ennead to imprison Wadjet in an Ushabti is an extremely big deal. They would have had to defy Ra himself to do that. So that is a story I would love to hear. But unfortunately, they don't tell us that story, at least not in season 1. The last Ushabti I could identify is Neith. She can be found right above Khonshu. The goddess Neith is considered a primary creator, similar to the sky goddess Nut of the Ennead. She is seen with the Ankh, the wasp scepter, and the red crown of Lower Egypt. She is a goddess of war, weaving, and in some myths, the mother of all the gods, and the creator of both the earth and birth itself. Now, how a goddess like this was ever imprisoned in stone is beyond me. Even if she did something terrible, who the fuck could stop her? The only thing I can think of is that Marvel Universe gods age and die, and perhaps she was in a weakened state. She was often sought out to settle intense disputes and conflicts, and perhaps that is the role that earned her the judgment of the Ennead, but that is just pure speculation.
That is some really impressive deep dive into the basics of the gods of Heliopolis and the Ushabti that we see in the episode. That does put what we see in the show in context. Now, I do want to briefly mention one other god that is probably imprisoned, and that is Seth. Seth, otherwise known as Set or Sutek, is the god of deserts, storms, disorders, and violence. And in the comics, he's usually portrayed as a villain most of the time. I expect he's probably imprisoned because he's best known for killing Osiris. He got better. And trying to claim the throne of Egypt, making him an avowed enemy of both Horus and Osiris. But let's get into one of their other grudges. Am I the only one who gets the impression that the Ennead just mostly really just hate Khonshu, and that's why they're so blinded to Hero's schemes? Because I like to think that if the gods are so aware of what Khonshu is up to at any given moment, it's strange that they don't really look at his accusations seriously at all. Granted that Khonshu is not a particularly likable god, and he treats his avatars horribly, but there isn't even a pretense of a fair inquiry by the Ennead. I just really get the feeling that there's some bad blood between Khonshu and the other gods, and they're just inclined to assume the worst of Khonshu because they hate him. Because otherwise, I can't imagine that they just let Harrow walk without even seriously questioning his actions in any way. The whole council scene felt more like a trial of Khonshu than any kind of impartial inquiry into what Harrow has done. Am I alone in feeling that way?
I have to agree with you on the basis of how both you and I think justice should be done. That was in no way a fair trial, and the Ennead, with the exception of Hathor, were definitely not impartial judges in any way, and they made that perfectly clear in their opening statements to Khonshu. But I think that the issue that me and you are having here is trying to apply American law to ancient Egyptian justice, at least as it refers to the Ennead. The final judgment of Osiris was to ascertain whether or not a person was even worthy of being considered for Osiris's final judgment and eternal life in the field of reeds. I think that the Ennead was called on, and both Khonshu and Harrow had to prove they were even worthy of consideration. This is why Harrow told them not to consider the words of a shamed god. Harrow was trying to prove that Khonshu did not deserve a voice in that court. It did not help that Khonshu did nothing to claim his innocence, as his one is supposed to do when they faced the 42 divine judges of the final judgment, and instead make accusations and verbal attacks. I have to assume that a similar procedure of court etiquette was in play here, but you wanted to talk a bit about Layla and Mark Stevens' relationship, right?
Sure, but before I do, I just find Khonshu's actions toward the trial to be a bit weird. Some of his behavior can be attributed to Khonshu's arrogance, and this contributes to the god's hatred of him in turn. But he had to have known that he was walking into a firing squad, and he doesn't seem to have a plan for it at all. But as you say, let's get back to our heroes. So from here, Mark tries to dig up more info on Harrow, only to be intercepted by Layla. This leads into a conversation that establishes a bit more about what happened between them, and also the biggest rift between the two: Mark's tendency to keep secrets, and Layla's need to know Mark completely. The other big problem is that this version of Mark tends to go it alone, and Layla doesn't like him shutting her out. This is a marriage that clearly had some difficult issues, and it's not hard to imagine why they were on the verge of divorce. Is this a relationship that had any chance of working if Khonshu was out of the picture, or were they always going to end up drifting apart like this?
I I don't think there was ever any real hope for the relationship in the MCU, even if Khonshu was out of the picture. And I'm not saying that's going to happen anytime soon, unless the MCU does the Age of Khonshu story from the comics. Mark would require years of therapy and counseling before he would be in any shape to even consider a relationship. At the same time, Layla is so used to avoiding her problems by running away from them, like she does about her father's death. Don't get me wrong. I'm actually rooting for the two of them, but neither of them are anywhere near where they need to be to get there. But let's talk about the Midnight Man appearance.
That's pretty much how I feel as well. I like them together a lot, but they have a lot of baggage that's difficult to work through, even under the best of circumstances. But let's get to Midnight. So we see in the MCU's version of the Midnight Man, Anton Mogart, who appears as a collector of Egyptian artifacts. While very much a different character than the version in the comics, they did keep the collector angle intact. For a short-term antagonist, using Mogart here was not a bad decision, even if this is a very different kind of take on him. However, his appearance here is bittersweet. While I think that Gaspar Ulliel did a good job in the role, he sadly passed away in early 2022. It was sad. Still, he's memorable in this episode, and his relationship with Layla in this episode makes his presence more complicated. It's also different than what they did with Marlene in the comics, who ended up shooting Mogart at the end of Moon Knight's first encounter with him, and it's awesome. The action scenes that follow get back to the kind of rhythm that I missed with Mark and Marlene in the comics. Layla, like Marlene, is a reasonably good fighter, but she doesn't show up Moon Knight in this episode. Likewise, you get some really good action with Mark taking on Mogart's goons, though I think my favorite bit was Mark gliding with the Crescent Moon cape, which is a signature move from the comics. If I have any issues with the scene at all, is that they take the healing armor to Wolverine levels here. And it's only an issue because they switch to Stephen Grant in the middle of the fight, and he does his wacky comic relief routine. Grant gets impaled for his trouble in the Mr. Knight suit, and then he switches back to Mark. I just didn't really care for that moment. I don't think the fight really needed it, and the episode would have been better without it. Tonally, it just threw me out of the scene. I think Grant does get some decent scenes here in this sequence, but it's more the plot-related moments related to Egyptology and the treasure hunting where he's better suited. But for the most part, I really enjoyed this whole sequence. But I think there's another problem you wanted to bring up involving the fight scene, Mike.
There is actually, but you covered a bit of the stuff I would like to comment about, specifically the Midnight Man thing first. I liked how Anton Mogart described his thievery of precious relics and pieces of Egypt's history and what he calls philanthropic preservation, but one that only he can enjoy, as Layla pointed out. But one more thing I did notice, while we don't actually know if he died, we only saw Moon Knight throw a crescent dart at him and heard the sound that it hit him and his noises of pain as he rode away. If he did die, I'm going to be looking for Jeff Wild on the horizon.
Yeah, that would make the most sense rather than recasting him. Gaspard Ulliel was just so good that I wouldn't want to compete with that, especially when they have a built-in workaround. As you pointed out, they could just bring Jeff Wild into season 2 if need be, but I digress.
Nice. So we agreed with that. But to get to your question, Mark takes several very close up shots from what looked like a 45 or perhaps a Desert Eagle, and he didn't even flinch. There wasn't even so much as a mark on his suit. That left me with the impression that the bullets were being deflected off the magical armor. But then multiple spears pierce Mark's flesh, and he even gets pinned to the ground with them. What makes it even weirder is that if you pay attention, you'll notice that the spear that went through Mark's back and out his stomach just disappears or supposedly falls off, or just because he stands up, suggesting that maybe he pushed the spears out with his guts and organs. I don't know. But at no point was there any blood. I also have to agree that there was no need for Mr. Knight in that scene, and the comedy really does take you right out of it. But what did you think about the ending for this episode, Steve?
There is a weird inconsistency in that fight, agreed. So while I appreciate what they're trying to set up with the ending, I do think it was a bit flawed. Some of the points are actually really clever, like the idea that the star chart was inaccurate. That actually does make sense, and the map would be based on the night sky 2,000 years ago. The idea that precession would cause the results to be inaccurate makes perfect sense. I can also buy Stephen Grant to make sense of the map since it gives him something useful to do. And then they decide that the only way to get proper result is to have Khonshu move the sky to get the same result as that night 2,000 years ago when the chart was made. The problem is that Layla brought her tablet to take pictures of the night sky. Why is that a problem? Because a professional Egyptologist like Layla would probably have apps on her tablet that could calculate precession without needing any kind of divine intervention. They could do simulated models of the night sky that calculate precession. There is absolutely no need for Khonshu to pull this stunt, but they have to have him do it so that the Ennead can turn him to stone. It just comes across as an unfortunate plot hole in what's otherwise a fun episode.
Well, here's the problem with the whole app idea. Those star charts would be based on mathematical prediction, and while highly probable, cannot be guaranteed as accurate. There could have been factors that were not considered, like cosmic events that change things we are not aware of. Whereas Khonshu was literally there and remembers every night that has ever been. All of that to say, I think you're being a little hard on it. Maybe it was not beautifully written and wrapped in a nice bow, but I don't think it is quite the plot hole that you think it is. But again, I specify that this is just my opinion. Granted, my whole thing is just novice speculation, but what do you think of that, my friend?
For me, the problem is that provoking the Ennead's wrath isn't worth the risk when there are other ways, even if not perfectly accurate, to calculate the tomb's location. Layla could have done the calculation on the tablet and then asked Khonshu to confirm whether the results looked the way he remembered it. It wouldn't have looked as cool, and it wouldn't have set up the next episode the way it was planned, but it's not implausible. But let's move on to the next episode. With the fourth episode, we start getting into the kind of storytelling I was hoping for with the show, at least at the start. You pretty much get Mark and Layla as the Indiana Jones and Marion of this episode, with some fun treasure hunting and high adventure as they explore Amit's tomb, and I was here for it. Stephen ends up taking control for most of the episode, but given that he's the archaeology buff, that makes a pretty good amount of sense. You do get a bit of Disney humor in these sequences as a result, but I found that some of these moments actually worked. Much of it's driven by the love triangle between Mark, Layla, and Stephen Grant, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but it leads to some fun moments here and there. If I need a protein shake, I'll call you, yeah? That line did get a chuckle. That it did. And I love that Mark punching Stephen in the face in retaliation for Stephen kissing his wife. That was so good. But it does get into a pretty messed up situation. It's a complicated situation because Stephen and Mark are both the same man. It's just that Layla prefers Grant's honesty over Mark's secretiveness. and they both share the same body, so there's the same physical attraction there, which has to be confusing. So I guess the question is there a way that a marriage like that could ever possibly work, or is it more likely to fail because of all the problems involved?
I think this is one area where the Layla character leans into her Marlene roots. As I recall, Marlene was initially in love with the Stephen Grant identity over Mark Spector, and that seems to be exactly what is happening here. But here's the foil. Marlene loves the whole person of Mark Spector, who is currently divided into sections. I don't think that could last. She loves Stephen's honesty and morality, his innocence, but she is a woman of action and would very soon get bored with the mild-mannered Stephen because he lacks the adventurous heart and badassery of Mark Spector. I think the man that Layla loves is the whole mind of Mark and not the fractured pieces individually, which are not enough for her. How does that sound to you?
That sounds reasonable. She loves certain aspects of both personalities, but it's not quite yet a Betty Ross situation. Betty has over time learned to love Bruce Banner in all of his aspects, understanding that they're all the same man. Layla doesn't have that understanding yet, and she hasn't faced the same trials that Betty did. She doesn't even seem to acknowledge that they're the same person at this point, not really. So let's get into where things start to fall apart. One thing that I picked up around this point, though it was apparent in past episodes, is that Harrow really loves to hear himself talk. He loves to make long-winded speeches, and as Mark pointed out in the last episode, he likes to get into people's heads and use it to his advantage. There is truth in what Harrow says, but that's really the problem with him. He gives you just enough truth to serve his purposes, but not the whole truth. So, knowing this, in the second half of the season, I started to get a little irritated with characters listening to Harrow talk, even after we see how he works. And we see this here again with Layla. Harrow plants a seed of doubt within Layla to sow divisions between her and Mark, partly to throw her off her game and partly to buy time while Harrow springs his trap in the tomb. Even if Harrow speaks the truth, he only tells the truth that benefits him in some way, and you can never fully trust that he's ever giving you the full picture of it. Personally, I just shoot and be done with it, but what was your impression, Mike?
I'll tell you how I see it. Arthur Harrow is a lot like Lucifer in that respect. His truths are but false guides that lead to sin, which, by the way, literally means to miss the mark. He provides you with a couple of solid footholds that lead to unstable ground and the chaos he claims to be against. While being against chaos and a proponent of order is very Egyptian, I think Harrow likes there to be chaos so that he can satisfy his lust for death and destruction. And all of that while dressed as an angel of light, I might add. Harrow is one of the worst kinds of evil. At least Amit is who she is, and that's all she can be. Harrow wears just enough light to cover the abyss inside of him. But let's talk about the tomb.
I can definitely see the Lucifer comparison, especially with the idea that Harrow was a previous avatar. So you can see Harrow as a son who hates his father in the same way that Lucifer hates his own father, God. I can buy totally into that take. Moving on to the tomb, I actually thought that what they did with the identity with the pharaoh was pretty clever. It is true that Alexander the Great was a pharaoh of Egypt, as were the descendants of his general Ptolemy I. Also, contrary to whatever Netflix might tell you, Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was one of these Ptolemaic descendants, so she is Macedonian Greek. It's also true that Alexander's tomb was lost. Alexander died in Babylon, but since then there hasn't been any clear confirmation of where he was buried. There have been many theories over the centuries, including that he was buried in Alexandria or in Macedonia or in various places in the Siwa oasis in Egypt. So this is historically plausible as far as I know. But to bring this back to Moon Knight, I like the idea that Alexander at some point conquered Egypt and then became an avatar of Amit. It explains some of the reports of his seeming invincibility, so that's a cool idea to introduce. It's a good way to bring in real history and Egyptology while also adding to the mythic narrative of the series.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to talk about the tomb for a minute, and it will lead into my thoughts on Alexander the Great. Remember that Bast was guarding the entrance to the tomb. Bast is, of course, the goddess of the Wakandans, but in Egypt, she was even more. Bast was a protector and guardian of Lower Egypt. She was the patron goddess of firefighters because Egyptians believed that a cat running through a building on fire would draw the flames out. not sure where they came up with that one, but she was also one of the goddesses who was known as the Eye of Ra, or the Eye of Autumn, the sun. To put a powerful protector like her at the entrance of the tomb was quite a statement to how important what is inside is. As a quick side note, I can't figure out why Layla wrote L on Bass Paw. Uh, the word in the context of the surname means from the family of, or of the. Um, like her last name, El Foley, means from the family of Foley. So why would she just write the L part in being, especially being that she's Egyptian? It should have been the whole thing, or even just Foley. But that is neither here nor there, I guess. Sorry to go on a little side trail there. The people who built the tomb of Amit did not stop with Bast at the front door. Further in, Stephen and Leia find out that the Eye of Horus was actually built into the structure of the tomb, which is pretty significant. That signifies a few things, actually. One, whoever is in this tomb was a pharaoh, as pharaohs were said to be the embodiment of Horus on earth. Plus, Horus is the patron deity of the pharaohs. That is how they knew the last avatar of Ammit was a pharaoh. The Eye of Horus is also a symbol of both protection and healing. There are several protection spells, but the fact that Bast was at the front door and they used the Eye of Horus for protection says that the tomb itself was made to be protection at the highest levels. They called in the big guns here. That the pharaoh turned out to be none other than Alexander the Great dates this tomb to 323 BC, when Alexander of Macedonia died. I can't really fit Alexander spreading the ideologies of Amit into what I know of him historically. He was about spreading undiluted Greek culture, not any others. But considering that the liberties that Marvel tends to take, I can see where a story where Amit empowered Alexander and perhaps was even the reason for his success. Or perhaps something took place after he died in Babylon. I have no idea. But like you, I still thought that was cool. But you had something to add about Layla's father, right?
Yes, but to your point, Alexander was always about adopting elements of the cultures of the nations that he conquered as a way of pacifying them. So I could see him adopting Amit for that reason. But the show also implies that Alexander turned against Amit, which is why she was imprisoned for thousands of years. And that makes sense because Alexander would not have been killable as long as he was an avatar. The idea probably would need some explaining, but I think it could be worked around.
I hadn't connected Alexander to the avatar Amit once had, whose scales were balanced and ended up causing her to be imprisoned in stone for 2,000 years. But that idea definitely fits into what you're saying there. That is a very nice observation. That seems so obvious now that you explained it that way. Well done, my friend. But I believe you had a bit more to add there, didn't you?
Sure. So, to your question, let's talk a little bit about what happened to Layla's father. It plays very much out like Marlene's backstory, with her father being killed by Raoul Bushman. Bushman isn't mentioned by name in this episode, but Mark refers to his partner getting greedy and killing everyone in the tomb. That is pretty much what happened in Moon Knight's origin story. The difference is that Marlene always knew what happened to her father, and it was never played as any kind of mystery. Now, I appreciate that they kept to the comics on those details. They play it that way here for drama, though, and this is again why nobody should let Haro talk for any length of time. The only real issue that I have with all this is that Layla should be sensible enough to save her confrontation with Mark until after they escape the tomb. Granted that truth matters most to Layla, and that Haro hit a sore point with her father, but she has to know that he's trying to manipulate her. Mark even points this out during their argument. In the previous episode, she even expressed that she was willing to hold off on their personal problems because stopping Harrow was more important. Well, that got forgotten real quick. Sure enough, Harrow shows up with a bunch of armed goons to steal the MacGuffin. I understand Layla's position on an emotional level, really I do, but I just felt like she should have been more sensible than that. But what was your take on the scene, Mike?
I have to agree with you there. I think that Layla is smart enough to put her issues aside to get the job done. As you pointed out, they both agreed back on the boat there on the way to Anton Mogart's house that they were going to put their issues aside until they accomplished their mission. On the flip side of that, I think this is even more proof that Layla and Mark cannot last as a couple. Neither of them are in a space to be any real good for the other. Besides, Layla knew that Harrow was manipulating her, as you pointed out, and she let him do it anyway. I think that some of that anger while pointing at Mark was actually intended for herself, for running away from her pain instead of facing it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a very tragic romance when you think about it. Mark is unable to be honest as himself, and she can only get the truth when he's Stephen Grant. Their love is genuine, and you want to see them work their issues out, but broken trust is the kind of thing that damages relationships, even when one of them isn't a complete mental case. But it probably is Layla taking out anger at herself for not having suspected sooner, or not wanting to acknowledge certain things, or from running from the situation. They need serious couples counseling.
Yes, they do, my friend, and a lot of it. But I would like to switch over to Harrow shooting Mark Spector. After getting shot, Mark wakes up in a mental health facility. But in reality, as I have been saying this whole episode, I think he is trapped in his own mind. That's the only way I can make sense of this. But I also wonder if this isn't what it's like in Mark's mind without Conchu. What made me think about that was the two sarcophagus that Mark came across. Both of them had someone inside that was fighting to get out. The first one had Stephen Grant in it, and I think that the second one had Jake Lockley in it. And I think that the mid-credit scene at the end proves that. What's more is I think that Jake is the ultra violent third personality that we saw appear in episode 3. I think something inside of them told them not to let him out, and that's why he didn't open it. And that really fits into my theory about them being in Mark's mind and explains how Steven and Mark could interact the way they did. I've been kind of building to this point, really, kind of throughout this episode so far. And I got to ask, are you picking up what I'm putting down, or do you perhaps have a contrasting theory that explains these things?
Firstly, I definitely agree that the sealed sarcophagus is heavily implied to be the Jake Lockley persona. It also explains why he never shows up in these episodes. As to how it fits with the theory you brought up with episode 2, I can see the connecting points you're bringing up. I think there are many different ways you could read this that are valid, and I'm curious to see how you connect the rest of what's going on. Still, I was a bit bothered by the pacing of episode 4, because I felt like the tail end with the asylum should have been the start of episode 5. You could have gotten a great cliffhanger with Mark dying and then waking up in the asylum. It's a great WTF moment to start with, but then they go on longer with it, which feels like the first act of an episode, and then it abruptly ends with fighting Stephen Grant and then meeting the Hippo Goddess. You could have gotten more tomb hunting fun with the stuff in episode 4 and then maybe hit the viewer with the shock of Mark being killed before realizing that there's more to it. Time management is something that Disney shows sometimes have problems with, and it seems that that might have been the case here. But what were your initial impressions of the asylum ending?
I suppose that I can see what you're saying about the break in the tomb hunting stuff, but I'm not sure I can say that I felt the same. I think that you needed the intensity of that moment when Mark was being shot by Harrow attached to that moment of falling into the darkness and coming up in the asylum. In my personal opinion, that scene would have to have been replayed in episode 6, and I'm not sure that would have carried the same weight without what happened before being right before it. The moment would have lost something to me. I also don't think that they could have put that moment into a different spot. Mark had to die at that moment for things to work out the way they did, and not just for Mark, but for Layla, who saw him die as well. You know, it is amazing the things that we are capable of instantaneously letting go once someone dies. In that moment, we realize just how petty and irrelevant it all was compared to that person being dead now. Things just don't carry the same weight they did when the person was alive. I think Layla needed to go through that just like how Mark needed to sort things out in his mind. But I understand we got some Easter eggs to talk about.
That sounds fair to me. So let's dive into the references and the Easter eggs, because I know you love those, Mike.
Yeah.
The whole asylum segment was drawn straight from the Jeff Lemire run. If you want details on that, I suggest going back and listening to part 1 of this episode, because I break down the setup of Lemire's run fairly thoroughly. Mark was not dead in that version of the story, but Amit was the doctor in the asylum in the original story. So it seems like they decided to substitute Amit with Harrow for the purposes of the show, which is totally fine.
It seems to fit perfectly well, but if I could touch on a couple things from the comic that were an inspiration for the asylum scenes. The asylum Mark was in was Putnam Psychiatric Hospital, and that is a specialist mental health center based in Chicago, Illinois, right out of the comics. One thing that is different, though, is that Mark apparently checked himself into the hospital rather than his father doing it. But in both cases, Mark's doctor, Dr. Harrow, was a psychiatrist who was adept at hypnosis. And like Dr. Emmett, Spectre's particular case and his subsequent adventures as Moon Knight seem to have caused a fixation to develop in Dr. Harrow towards Mark Spectre. Not to mention, Mark's busted up nose and darkened eyes were right out of the comics as well. Also, Dr. Harrow suggests that Mark has been fighting with imaginary people, which certainly sounds like a made up excuse to cover for the guards and avoid severe shock therapy. But you had some more stuff on the comics to talk about, right?
I hadn't noticed those, but that is really cool. But there's more. In episode 5, there's a reference to Bertrand Crawley, who is one of Moon Knight's informants and friends in the Doug Mensch run in the comics. Crawley is the one who's hosting the bingo games in the asylum, and I did not notice this until my second playthrough. Crawley was also present in the Jeff Lemire asylum story that this episode was loosely based on. If you want to know more about Crawley, I talk about him in much more depth in part 1. There's just one other cool thing I want to point out, and I suspect this was Ethan Hawke's idea. Look at how Harrow looks as the asylum doctor. Is it me, or does Ethan Hawke look like Stan Lee in the asylum scenes? In his later years, Stan had very similar hair and glasses, as well as a mustache that looked much like Harrow's. Stan was also known for wearing the sweater and button-down shirt look like Ethan Hawke wears in those episodes. I have the feeling that Hawke modeled his performance after Stan Lee, and then they just ran with it. If so, he does a really good job with it. Even now, Stan is still the king of cameos.
You know, I actually didn't pick up on that at all when in any of the 4 times I watched it. But now that you mentioned, I can totally see the similarities. There definitely seems to be something like that going on. But we have to talk about the giant hippo in the room.
And it's definitely not Boja the Blessed, I can tell you that. So it's revealed that the hippo goddess is Towerette, and she drives the ship leading to the Field of Reeds. However, because Mark and Grant's hearts aren't full, they're in danger of being taken off the boat and into the Duat. So most of the episode is about the two aspects of Mark confronting their past, with the two personalities trying to find some way to coexist. So while the details are changed, it does take some influence from Jeff Lemire's run. But Mike, I think you had some points you wanted to make about Towerette and how she's portrayed in this show.
Well, I can point out something that I find interesting. Taweret doesn't seem to have done any of this for quite a while. She had no idea what she was supposed to say. And when she took out Mark and Stephen's heart, she was afraid that their chests were going to burst open from her reaching in and taking them out. Bear in mind that she is only listed as someone who guides the souls of the dead into the afterlife in the Book of the Dead. She is not listed anywhere else as an underworld deity. This leads me to believe that when Abdullah El Foli, the first Scarlet Scarab and Layla's father, died, and Taweret led him through the Duat until he reached the Field of Reeds, that Anubis had not yet been imprisoned in the Ushabti, and he was there to weigh Abdullah's heart. Also, Taweret rides what I think is supposed to be something like Ra's Atat barge, or maybe even the actual barge itself, as the sun does come up when Taweret reaches the gates of Osiris. But there is no sign of Ra anywhere. In this scenario, we see that the Hall of Truth and the 42 divine judges, minus the few Ennead who have survived, have been removed from this equation. So there is no part where Amit devours the soul of the person who does not pass the test of the actual scales. No, she uses her own scales and her own method of judgment. We don't see her devouring any souls at all until the last episode, and it is not because the souls have gone through the final judgment for what they have done. Rather, it is spurning the gods to assume that right for herself, her avatar, and by extension, his disciples.
That sounds like a plausible theory. It does seem like they didn't adapt Egyptian myth exactly here, but it is possible to connect the dots by doing the work of the show. Let's talk about the memories that we see on Toweret's ship. Many of the revelations that we see in this episode are fairly comics accurate, which I appreciated. They show the origin of Moon Knight, including a dying Mark Spector reaching the statue of Khonshu. They also dig back into the Jeff Lemire run again, especially mainly in using the retcons about Mark's past and how Stephen Grant was always a separate identity. As I mentioned in part 1, I do have issues with the Lemire retcons in the context of the comics, but you can check out that episode if you're interested in the specifics. In any case, the show does fairly present those scenes in the various flashbacks aboard the ship. What I think the show adds to the formula are a few things. One, the idea that Mark created Stephen Grant as an identity to retreat into to avoid the pain of his mother's abuse. Because she blamed Mark for Randall's death, she took out her pain and grief on Mark. To deal with it, Mark used a favorite character from the Tomb Buster movie, also an invention, as a basis for this new persona. Meanwhile, Stephen Grant is living in a delusion where he believes his mother is alive and not the person who abused him. I think we also start to understand why Mark had rejected his father's path as well. Though it's not stated in this episode, I think it's likely that Mark did this because his father was too weak to protect him from his mother's abuse. So this is why Mark focuses on becoming a stronger person, later deciding to enlist in the military. It may be Mark wanting to be tougher so that he can't be hurt again, or it could be Mark rejecting his father because of his weakness and not standing up for him. All in all, I thought that the flashback scenes were pretty solid and were true to the character. But did you have any other thoughts you wanted to add, Mike?
I liked the retcon myself. I think Khonshu is exactly the type of god that would seek out a person whose mind was already broken to plant his four aspects in. My guess is that the assimilation would not be as easy to do, or and maybe even impossible, without the host's mind being broken, which in turn speaks a lot of Arthur Harrow as well. What's more is I think that the way the MCU did it is more faithful to how DID actually works, at least in some respects, particularly how it starts. DID is predominantly caused by prolonged abuse that starts early in childhood, and that is exactly how they play it here. We talked about this a bit in part one, and you just brought up a very similar idea, so I would like to address that. It would seem that they definitely added the McKay stuff as well, with Mark talking about hating the weakness of his father and even potentially rejecting Judaism because of that. If you want to hear all the details, I would recommend you check out the last episode. But in the MCU, we see that Mark's little brother Randall was in the room full of people that Mark has killed, but Randall is alive. Notice that Mark goes around one by one and remembers each one and owns each of those deaths, and they're all corpses. But Randall is alive. I think this is a visual representation of Mark's conflicting feelings about his brother's death, his mother, her abuse, and his father Elias's weakness or refusal to put a stop to the abuse convinced Mark that he was responsible for Randall's death. But I think that deep down, Mark did not believe that lie, and I think that is why Randall is both alive and why he ran away from them. That day at his mother's Shiva is when Mark Spector walked away from both his father and his father's God, and the weight of it all broke him, and he retreated. And that's when he and Steven started blending together.
Agree. They based much of this on the Lemire retcon, which was built with the idea of establishing Mark's DID in a more believable way. Of course, I was fine with Ellis's idea that it was the result of Khonshu's influence affecting Mark's brain chemistry, but that's neither here nor there. For the MCU version, I think it's fine to go with the Lemire setup as you described, and I think that Randall's death particularly explains a lot about why Mark's so broken and damaged, and I think he prefers us to look at Randall as being alive, by the way. But I think there was something else you wanted to bring up, Mike?
There is, and this is admittedly a bit of a side note. But if I could point out something I didn't notice until my third time through, and that is that the baboon comes running out of the doors and down to where it's boat. I feel like a total dumbass for not noticing this the first time I watched it. But that baboon is the manifestation of the original moon god Thoth, Aten's brother. He is more known for other things now, like sacred texts, mathematics, the sciences, magic, as well as being a messenger and recorder of the deities, the master of knowledge, and a patron of scribes. But I find it interesting that the baboon was running out of the temple of Khonshu and onto the boat of Ra. Khonshu's father Amun was later fused with Ra, becoming Amun Ra, and something similar to that happened in the Marvel Comics. Thoth is basically hanging out on his brother's boat, visiting his nephew. But I believe you had one final thing you wanted to talk about with this episode. Am I right?
Yeah, but I can't believe I missed the Thoth connection, considering I write Thoth and Guardians of a Lamb. And on top of that, I remember the baboon aspect because he appears like that in Persona 5. But yeah, you're right about the baboon aspect, so good catch on that. The final thing I want to mention before we move on is Stephen Grant's sacrifice. For most of the show, he's this awkward and fearful person who just isn't built for fighting the way that Mark is. He's also combative and distrustful of Mark, and not without his reasons. But by this point, Steven seems to truly understand and accept Mark, even showing compassion to Mark when he's forced to relive his past and his most painful memories. There's a real bond that forms between them, and I think they start to regard each other as brothers sharing a body and not just as alters. I want to get into Mark's perspective about this when we talk about episode 6, but for now, I just want to say that this change in their relationship is likely why Steven decides to risk himself to save Mark, even if it means being lost in the duat forever. After episodes where Stephen Grant kind of annoyed me at times, this is a moment that helped the character in my eyes. There is a strength within Stephen Grant underneath the mild-mannered persona, and it was nice to see it in this scene.
You know, you talk about them becoming brothers, and I'm not saying that all brotherly relationships are like this, but in this particular case, I'm picking up on something, and I'm not sure if you're putting it down. I'm immediately reminded of the Winchesters. No matter how hard they fight or how many times they part ways, each of them knows that the other will come to their rescue if they get in some shit. Each one of them also knows that each one would give their lives to save the other. And when we're talking about the Winchesters, sometimes that means diving into the shit to pull them back out. Just before Stephen made his sacrifice, he said, "You've got this. That means I got this too." At first, I thought this was a reference to them both using the same body, but after what you said, I wonder if it was knowing that Mark would come back for him. I think that Mark's speech and actions proved that feeling was there for him. I think that is what you were putting down there, and I'm all for it. But let's dive into episode 6.
You picked it up perfectly, Mike. Yes, I do think that's where they're going with that relationship, but I have more to add about that. At the start of this episode, Mark is handed everything that he thinks he wants. He's in heaven, at peace with himself, and free of the chaos in his head. He's also free of Khonshu, who has caused him misery for so much of his life. But that peace has a cost. He has to let Stephen rot forever in the Duat, and if he stays, there's a good chance that Layla and many others will die because of Harrow. So Mark makes the only choice he can, and he decides to go back. But I think there's another reason that Mark goes back to save Stephen Grant. So let's get into my theory on this, and you can tell me if this makes sense to you. By this time, Mark regards Stephen as a brother and not like an alternate personality he wants to be rid of. And I think that relationship is key to Mark's decision to go back. We learned in episode 5 that Mark blames himself for the death of his brother. Even if it wasn't his fault, Mark blames himself for taking Randall to the cave in the first place. So he creates a new brother in his own mind, and that's Stephen Grant. I don't think that Mark could ever let Stephen die on his watch because he previously failed Randall and he couldn't live with the guilt of having done that. That leads Mark to the decision of abandoning everything he ever wanted to save his other self and then to try to save Layla as well.
Wow, that that sounds spot on to me. That certainly makes a lot of sense. I think I can add a bit to that though. So there are canopic jars literally everywhere in the asylum. There are canopic jars all over that room where the priest of Heka, the deification of magic and medicine in ancient Egypt, was working on the process of rebirth and rejuvenation. The snake shedding its skin and becoming new again, like a soul is reborn in the afterlife. The purpose of the canopic jars, which there are 4 of, is to hold the stomach, intestines, lung, and liver. The heart was left in the body so that the soul could rejoin with it when it was reborn. This is one of the reasons Egyptians were so obsessed with death. They believed that if the funerary rites were not done exactly how they were supposed to, even if one lived a virtuous life, they would have no body to return to, which means they would cease to exist. The absolute worst thing, the biggest thing that Egyptians feared. But speaking of rebirth and bringing this back around to my point, did you notice that Arthur Harrow put the amulet of Capri on Mark's body, just like the funerary priest would put the Capri scarab amulets on the deceased to aid in the process of rebirth? Throughout the series, Harrow has said that he feels bad for Mark and his condition, and that puts so many voices or identities in him. This makes me wonder if shooting Mark might have been more than just a means of obtaining Amitsu Shakti. But what if, believing in the myths as he does, Harrow did that to balance Mark's scales, perhaps as a form of penance? Harrow already said Mark's scales were in chaos, but consider Harrow's words as he stood up. Sometimes we need the cold light of death before we can see reality. Add that to the point of all of this. That is, in the next time we see Stephen and Mark, they are waking up, and very similarly to when we see when Stephen first woke up in episode 1. Except now, Stephen and Mark are talking directly to one another without the use of mirrors. And you'll notice that they say, "I can't believe it worked." In other words, they have been reborn. They've been rejuvenated. They are new. You'll notice that the moon at the end of the episode is full. But I believe you wanted to talk about Layla in this episode, didn't you?
I actually hadn't noticed what Harrow was doing until you explained it. I honestly was a bit thrown off by that because I didn't understand why Harrow put the amulet around Mark's neck. But thinking about it, it could be that Harrow regarded Mark as a kindred spirit in a way, as they were both avatars of the same god. In many ways, the two are the same, including the fact that both of them took pleasure in causing violence in Khonshu's name. It could have been Harrow's way of acknowledging that, in addition as Harrow seeking to balance the scales within himself for killing Mark. But let's move on. So Layla manages to survive the way out of the Tomb of Alexander, and she follows Harrow in the hopes of stopping him. She hears a message from Towerette, who leads her to release Khonshu. Now, I have to admit, I loved her confrontation with Khonshu, who tries to convince her to become his new avatar. But Layla wants nothing to do with Khonshu, and honestly, I can't blame her at all. After seeing what being Khonshu's avatar has done to Mark, seeing her call Khonshu out on all of his manipulations and the pain that he's caused was great to see. Not that Layla isn't playing her own game, since she wants Khonshu to bring back Mark, which he eventually does. But even if it was for our own reasons in part, I enjoyed seeing Khonshu getting called out on all of his nonsense for once. He has had this coming for the entire show.
He has had this coming for the entire show, but as far as I am concerned, he has had this coming for years. How long has Khonshu abused and tormented Mark? How long has Khonshu manipulated him? And how many times has he flat out abandoned him or even turned on him, like with the boogeyman? I felt like someone has needed to say that to him for a long time, and it was very satisfying to hear Layla do it. I love that Mark would not just let him casually mention her without rubbing in his face that he knew that Layla turned Khonshu down when he asked her to be his avatar. That was a good part. But I believe you had some more to add on episode 6.
Indeed, I do. The other interesting thing is that we see that once Moon Knight is resurrected, Mark and Steven have found a better balance between them. They're not like two people competing for a body now. They found a way to cooperate and act like a team that's sharing a body. They're learning to use their complementary strengths and cede control when the other personality is clearly more suited to handle the situation. This comes up especially when they start negotiating with Khonshu for their freedom. Steven is smart enough to see through Khonshu's deceptions, and Mark has the inner strength and the conviction to follow through on his decisions. While it may not be an ideal solution necessarily, it is a much more healthy one than what they were doing before episode 5.
I actually thought it was a pretty ideal situation. Mark and Steven needed Khonshu at that point, and he needed them. They got to stop Amit and save the world. As soon as it was over, despite all my beliefs to the contrary, Khonshu kept his word and released them. Well, sort of. And as far as Mark and Steven working together now in that final battle, it was pretty sweet. It was really cool seeing Mr. Midnight be badass like Mr. Knight can be. And the bouncing back and forth was some next level shit. I also enjoyed that just when you start to forget about old Jake Lockley, he seems to make an appearance and saves them both. But I understand you have some things to say about Taweret and her new avatar.
All of that was really, really good, but yes, I do. So that leads into the big change, which is that Layla becomes, at least for a time, the avatar of Towerette and takes the name and the mantle of the Scarlet Scarab. I'm honestly not 100% sure how I feel about this because I enjoyed Layla more as a non-powered supporting character, and she was perfect in the Marion role opposite Mark. She was also more than capable of handling herself in a fight as it was. It just seems now that if a side character is popular enough, they just have to give that person powers, and this also serves to diminish the main hero by making him less unique. One of my problems with the Hulk after Peter David, for instance, is that they basically make every side character into a Hulk-like character. Now, one character or two like that may not necessarily be bad, as in the case of Layla, but they just overdid it with the Hulk, and I just don't want to see the same thing happening with Moon Knight. At the same time, I also see where they were going for in this story, and the Towerette angle does make Layla much more than a Marlene Life love interest, so I can appreciate that. But what was your reaction to this, Mike?
Well, there does seem to be a general theme that all the people who believe that the gods were real ended up being avatars of the gods. There is a theme going on there beyond the cliche. I do agree, though, that every time a new hero or villain is added with the same motif, it lessens the original as they become less and less one of a kind. Actually, the only part I really hated about this was when Layla was holding up one wing that covered up her face and part of her torso, and the guy with the assault rifle never fires at her legs. I mean, I know I'm a bad guy, but I can't help but notice you can't protect your legs with those tiny wings. So I'll be nice and not shoot them. But seriously, as a quick side note, the new Scarlet Scarab, based on the MCU version, Layla El Foli, is set to debut in Moon Knight Volume 9, number 25 in September 2023 from writer Jed McKay and with art by Alessandro Cappuccio, Alessandro Vitti, and Partha Pratam. So I guess the MCU is making comic book characters. How about that?
I'm curious to see how they're going to deal with that. I don't mind bringing Layla into the comics if they can make it work, but how are they going to address the backstory? I mean, they can't play it exactly like they did it in the show without retconning out Marlene, which would be a huge mistake. So that's a challenge they're going to have to overcome. But fortunately, Jed McKay seems to be a good enough writer to tackle that problem. So it may very well be good. I did like the preview image that I have seen of her. But let's get back to the show. The ending gives Mark a choice that feels like something that Doug Mensch might have done. Mark is brought close to the edge, with Khonshu urging Mark to kill Harrow after he's defeated. But Mark refuses to do it, and I rather like this moment. Doug Mensch's Moon Knight would sometimes deal with choices like this, where he'd be tempted to inflict bloody vengeance and then hold himself back from crossing that line. We see something similar here, where he refuses to just do Khonshu's bidding and holds his ground on his moral decision. So my next question is this, Mike. How well was this moment handled, and do you think Mark made the right decision here?
Honestly, that part didn't make a whole lot of sense to me until I heard Layla say that you have a choice. You're already free. As Mark coming back from the dead, supposedly with tabula rasa, he has not yet killed and therefore weighted down his heart with sin. Mark and Steven got the chance to hit the reset button and choose a different path, and that is a great feeling. To be no longer bound to the chains of your past is something worth fighting for, and I can respect the hell out of that. But that is me thinking about the character himself. As a viewer of a Marvel horror show, I absolutely want Harrow and Amit to be brutally killed by Mark Spector. I think that is one of the things that makes the ending so satisfying. So why don't we talk about that, Steve?
I wanted to see Harrow go down as well, but I think it makes sense that it isn't Mark who makes that decision. He needs to not be Khonshu's vengeance at this moment, and he needs to realize that he can choose mercy. However, as we eventually see, Khonshu likes to weasel word his agreements. So let's talk about the ending and that big wham moment at the end of the episode. Everything seems to be okay at first, with Mark finding balance within himself and having made peace with Stephen Grant. And then we find out the game that Khonshu is really playing, as well as the first appearance of the Jake Lockley identity. I'll also add that I love the intro of Mr. Nice limo in that scene, which is straight out of the comics, down even to the license plate. Now that is attention to detail. But before I get to my thoughts on Lockley, Mike, what do you think is really going on with him?
I think that Khonshu got by on a technicality. You see, Stephen and Mark only made a deal for themselves with Khonshu, having forgotten all about the third sarcophagus in the Putnam Psychiatric Hospital of Mark's mind. They forgot all about Egypt on the rooftop. They figured Khonshu had no power over them anymore. But while they're technically right, there was no deal that says that Khonshu cannot use the more than willing, ultra-violent Jake Loxley as his avatar. It kind of makes me wonder if Khonshu didn't pick up a little lawyering knowledge from his Uncle Thoth. But that's just a thought. Next season, I want to see Raoul Bushman's face cut off.
That would be great. But I think the problem Mark and Steven had in negotiating this is that they don't seem to be aware of Jake yet. And they haven't put together the idea that there is another personality that they haven't accounted for. So I think they can be forgiven for overlooking Jake right now. So let's get into our overall impressions of Disney Plus Moon Knight. For the most part, I really like the show, and I think it's definitely one of the best parts of Phase 4 MCU. Granted that this isn't exactly the highest praise given how much of a disappointment Phase 4 has been, but still. There are some flaws in the series and some things that I wish had been adapted better or differently, but it respected the source material well enough, and it added new elements that I enjoyed. I'll add that I gained a new respect for Oscar Isaac as an actor, given how well he's able to play 4 different roles, including Khonshu, and make them all feel different. That is an impressive achievement, and Oscar Isaac just nailed it. I always felt coming in that he'd be a great Mark Spector, and he did not let me down in that at all. While I've been majorly disaffected by the MCU recently, I do hope there will be a season 2 because I've got to know what's going on with Jake Lockley. How about you, Mike? I know that you said you really enjoyed the show on first viewing, but how does it hold up now that you're more familiar with the comics?
Actually, I love the Moon Knight series even more, having watched it a total of 4 times now. It gets better every time as the layers get revealed. Moon Knight is easily my favorite MCU show without any question. In fact, I love Moon Knight like I loved Phase 1. I'm talking pure excitement over the show. Like when I first watched The Incredible Hulk kind of excitement. And I don't know how to give it a higher praise than that. I know that having some comics background with the character vastly improved my enjoyment of the show, and I always love it when mythology is mixed in with the story. Sure, there were things that were changed, but nothing worth giving it demerits for. And honestly, you have to expect that things are going to change in adaptations to film. While there are some exceptions, that is just a fact of Hollywood. This show, however, hit all the right notes.
Very cool. So that's a recommendation from both of us. With that, our two-part episode on Moon Knight comes to a close. It's been a lot of fun to talk about this character with Mike, and I'm glad to see that he's become as big a fan of Mark Spector as I am. As we've discussed, this is a character with some real depth and plenty of story mileage, and he deserves better than to be dismissed as just Marvel's Batman. As I think that we've seen in both the comics and the Disney Plus show, Mark Spector is far more than that, leading to a unique mythos with some memorable characters. Anyway, thank you for listening to this two-part coverage of Moon Knight, and I hope that you come away from it with a new understanding of the character and what he's about. I know I've had fun discussing it with Mike, and I hope that our listeners have as well. Until next time, thanks to all our listeners for tuning in, and thanks as always to our patrons who make this podcast possible.